Welcome. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this workshop of the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine, Laboratory Automation and Accelerated Synthesis, Empowering Tomorrow's Chemists, a workshop. My name is Nhon, and I am Associate Program Officer with the Board of Chemical Sciences and Technology at the Academies. This virtual workshop will take place over the next day and a half, and will explore the benefits of laboratory automation and opportunities to make this space more accessible for resource-limited institutions, as well as identifying ways to prepare the workforce. The event is hosted by the Chemical Sciences Roundtable, a standing activity that aims to provide a science-oriented, apolitical forum for discussing chemically related issues affecting government, industry, and universities. Before we begin, I would like to take a moment to thank our planning committee that organized this event, Drs. Martin Burke, Timothy Jameson, Shane Kriska, Anne LaPointe, Robert Maleczka, Arslan Mirzafari, and Nicola Pohl, as well as Rebecca Matz and Rachel Switzky. This team worked for over a year and a half to plan for this event and overcame many obstacles, as we all did, with dealing with the Delta variants. I would also acknowledge our two sponsors, the U.S. Department of Energy and the National Science Foundation. We greatly appreciate your support for the Roundtable. Thank you to our speakers and panelists for taking the time to attend and contribute to this workshop. We are all excited to hear your talk and your contributions. Finally, I want to give a special thanks to our Academy staff, Ayanna Lynch, Jessica Wolfman, and Eric Edkin. They have put in a tremendous amount of time and effort to put together this virtual event, and we hope will be engaging for everyone. And again, last but not least, I want to thank the audience. You all could have been anywhere in cyberspace, but you chose to be with us today, and for that, we appreciate you. All right, next slide, please, Anna. As a reminder to our committee members, invited speakers, and the audience, the National Academies are committed to the principles of diversity, integrity, civility, and respect in all of our activities. We look to you to partner in this community by helping us to maintain a professional and cordial environment. All forms of discrimination, harassment, and bullying are prohibited in any NASEM event. This commitment applies to all participants in all settings and locations in which NASEM works and any social events, including committee members, workshops, conferences, and other works and social functions where employees, volunteers, sponsors, vendors, or guests are present in person or virtually. The link to our full policy on harassment and bullying can be found in the Zoom chat. And if you experience any issues during this event, please feel empowered to contact myself, any staff officer, either via Zoom chat or email, or you can contact NASEM Human Resources directly if you prefer to do so. Note that the workshop agenda and speaker biographies can also be found on our website for your references. Full posters that will accompany the poster session during the lunch are also available on the website for your viewing. So if you click on that URL link, that will take you to all the information that I've mentioned. As a brief overview, the workshop will be comprised of 2 panel sessions, a virtual poster session, interaction breakout sessions, and talks from speakers. So we have a menu of activities for you all to participate in today. All right, so now time for some logistics. All right, so if you would like to verbally express your questions or comments during the panel session, please use the raise your hand feature, which you can find in the bottom right-hand corner if you hit the reaction. So do feel free to keep your cameras on as well throughout the workshop if you are comfortable doing so. And also for making your experience as engaging as possible, please set your screen set to speaker view. And you can do that by clicking the view button on the upper right-hand corner. And also remember to be respectful. Next slide, please. During the poster sessions and breakout sessions, we will be moving into various Zoom breakout rooms, and you can do so by clicking on the breakout room on the bottom right-hand corner. If in any situation you are encountering some technical problems or can't move from room to room, you can click the Ask for Help button. And please remember to turn on your cameras if possible for maximum participation. And these instructions will be repeated again as we get closer to the breakout room activities. And with that, I would like to introduce Marty Burke and Nicola Pohl, who are both members of the Chemical Sciences Roundtable, as well as members of the Workshop Planning Committee. Dr. Burke is the May and Ving Lee Professor of Chemical Innovation at University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, where his research group is pioneering in the development of molecular prosthetics. Dr. Pohl is the Associate Dean for the Natural and Mathematical Sciences and Research in the College of Arts and Sciences, and a Professor of Chemistry and Joan and Marvin Carmack Chair of Bioorganic Chemistry at Indiana University at Bloomington. Their research interests includes automation and flow chemistry, fair principles in science, and the development of methods for the synthesis and analysis of carbohydrates and glycopeptides. Without further ado, Marty and Nikki, please take the floor.
Good morning, Nikki.
Good morning. Great to see you.
Great to see you. Thank you so much for proposing we get together to have a coffee chat about how excited we are about automated synthesis.
Yeah, sorry I can't be in DC, but this is awesome.
Yeah, no, absolutely. We're going to forge ahead despite the challenge of being online, and we're so excited to have the chance to get together and talk about this really important and very exciting topic. And I wanted to start off by asking your thoughts. So I was giving a talk recently, and at the end, one of the audience members asked me, all this automated synthesis stuff, is this going to take my job? And I honestly, I was kind of caught off guard. I didn't know how to answer the question. I was wondering what you thought. How do you answer that question? Because you must get this one a lot when you give your talks as well.
Yeah. So, I mean, some of the parts of my job I wouldn't mind having taken. I think of all the manual fraction collecting I did as a grad student. I'm thinking, a robot, they should have that job. But because then I'd have so much more time for creative thought. There's so much more time to plan experiments, so much more time to think about the experiments if I didn't have to actually physically do so many of the manual operations. So I'm not that worried about a robot taking my job because robots are never going to be programmed to be truly creative. Plus, they don't know what humans actually want, right? And these robots are doing work for us.
Wow, yeah, that's a good answer. I just kind of sat there silent in a moment of awkward silence, but I like your answer better. I mean, now I have a chance to think about it. I mean, the other thing I came up with afterwards, but forgot to say at the time, in some ways, it allows us to aim higher, right? So we think about we can redefine what our job is, right? So if we've got robots that can help us do certain things, we can aim for goals that are currently feeling out of reach, right? But all of a sudden, they actually start to look more accessible when you've got some robotic assistants to really help you get there. So to me, it feels like an amazing opportunity. I was thinking about it. Can you imagine a biologist not having a PCR machine and trying to do their job, right? It's an interesting way to kind of think about what our chemistry world might look like if all of a sudden we had robots that could help us out on the synthesis side. So, all right, interesting. I mean, the other one that came up, someone asked the question around reproducibility. And again, I know you've thought a lot about this in terms of whether automation helps or hurts in that context. Can you remind me what you were kind of telling me the other day?
Yeah, so I mean, you think about it, if a robot, you program it to do a certain thing, it'll do the same thing over and over and over again. It won't get bored. It won't get tired. It doesn't need another cup of coffee. It'll do in the same exact reaction over and over again. And so that means you can trust the results a little better, including the negative results, which is one of the cool things. You can not only start doing more reactions at once, but you can also know that they were all done exactly the same way, and you can start trusting your negative results too.
Absolutely. I mean, one of the other things kind of continuing on that I think it's really exciting, and we were talking about this before, the data science component becomes much easier to integrate right into the chemistry workflow if you've got automation on the chemistry side. And that opens up so many amazing possibilities for problem solving differently, right? Where we can leverage kind of the power of data, and that reproducibility becomes critical. Right. And it's not that we don't trust our grad students that they have, fantastic skills in the lab, but it's just a whole nother level of kind of integrating data science and reproducible data generation if you've got a robotic platform. So yeah, anyway, those seem like great takeoff points. I wish I had talked to you before I got that question at the conference. Those were really great.
Fortunately, there's lots of time to keep talking. This is
Absolutely.
just the field at the very beginning. So you think about all that high throughput screening has done for biology, and now it'd be nice to have enough compounds to put in those high throughput screens, which is of course part of the motivation for places like NIH to really start funding and looking into automated chemistry more heavily.
Yeah, absolutely. And NSF as well. And I think I saw a few of them on the line. So this is good. So
This is good.
okay. So the question you were asking me the other day, remind me what you're talking about with this centralized versus decentralized with automation. What did you mean by that?
Yeah, so you think about, you've got your Starbucks coffee cup there, right? So there are a lot of little towns in the US that didn't have any coffee shops before Starbucks sort of gave people a sense for what coffee could be. But now, I've got my locally owned, woman-owned, fair trade, organic, of course, roasted coffee here. And part of, that also gives me more options than just going to the local Starbucks. And so you can think of having robotic centers just all in core facilities or, certain parts of the country, like these really high field NMR instruments, or you can start thinking about it, can we design the automation so that it's cheap and easy enough that everyone has one in their own lab, instead of going to a normal fume hood with my stir plate and round bottoms. Now I've got a little mini automation setup in every single fume hood in my lab. And that would be a sort of a decentralized approach as opposed to these huge mega core facilities, in the way that a lot of pharmaceutical companies have also set up these huge centralized facilities that everyone in the company can go use. So that's what I was thinking in terms of centralized versus decentralized.
Yeah, I mean, it makes a lot of sense. I mean, if you look at what happened with peptide synthesis, which is obviously an inspiring example of what automated synthesis can do, I guess in the end, it turned out to be both, right? So we have these centralized facilities. In fact, a lot of companies now, right? I mean, when my students want to make a peptide, they don't go in the lab and stir things in a flask. They go on a computer and dial in a sequence of amino acids, and then FedEx takes care of the delivery. So, but I guess at the same time, like you said, some labs want to do some very specialized, unique things, and then automation becomes kind of a key piece of hardware in their lab, right? They can be used just like the HPLC. You kind of use the synthesizer to help you solve your thesis problem. So I think it makes a lot of sense that both seem to be very helpful.
Yeah, and the other thing is, how do we develop new chemistries for those automated peptide synthesizers? My group's doing a lot of glycopeptide synthesis, and then we can't send it to a core facility because they don't have the glyco amino acid that we need, because we've developed the chemistry to make it. So if we want to have new chemistries developed for automation, it'd be great if we had it in hundreds and hundreds of fume hoods around the world to develop that new chemistry, and then certain things could be centralized.
Yeah, no, I love that. And actually, I love that concept of where, automation really allows us to think different about what synthesis could be. And
that's the exciting part. Yeah, we're both chemists.
So for 200 years, we've been kind of doing it one way. And maybe with automation, it's an opportunity for us to take a step back and think different. Maybe it could be much more generalized and modularized. And you can even imagine Lego kits where things could be snapped together in very powerful ways to make lots of different, not just structures, but functions, right? I mean, this is to me one of the most exciting parts is, does automation allow us to start transitioning from our focus on making molecules to making molecular functions? I think it's a really exciting question. That's one that we definitely get really excited about too.
Yeah, and the other thing we get excited about here is that you can think about new chemistries that you would just not be fast enough as a human being to do. So you can think about, quick temperature ramps or other things that can put your molecules in different states to allow new chemistries that you can't do if you're trying to do it the old-fashioned way with a stir plate and a round bottom.
No,
so there's also some excitement.
Definitely. I like that. Actually, another one would be safety, right? There's lots of opportunities to take reactions that are tough, right? There are definitely safety challenges and hazards. And maybe with automation, you can really help improve, right, those safety parameters, or with flow, just make small amounts very quickly and then use them and things like that. So it really does open up a lot of opportunities to think different about how do you make the lab safer, right? And this could be really powerful.
Definitely. Let's toast to that.
Yeah, that sounds good. That sounds good. So what about some of the challenges? Because we talked about this a couple different times, and I think you had brought up, some of the ethics around automation in chemistry. And actually, I don't know if you saw the New York Times yesterday. There was a really interesting article about 3D printing guns. You say, oh, this is obviously not good. So, obviously different technologies can be used for good or for bad. And I know you've put a lot of thought into this. Remind me where you are on that.
Yeah, so the ghost guns article was really scary, and that's something my lab has thought about too. It's like, well, if we want super reproducible chemistry, which of course we all do, especially how many of us have gone to the lab and had troubles reproducing something that one of our lab mates had just done. So the ideal is to have totally reproducible, accessible, interoperable. We can give it to other labs around the world. But that in theory also means that anyone in the world can easily, quickly reproduce it for any purpose. Just like the ghost guns, right? 3D printing you can think about 3D printing all sorts of medical devices, but now we've also got the possibility of 3D printing things that we didn't anticipate and certainly don't want. And so the same thing with chemicals, right? You think about the illicit drug industry is also huge compared to the licit drug industry. And how do we make sure that we don't make it so easy and so low barrier that anyone who doesn't really know what they're doing can now make any chemical in the world?
Yeah, actually, it's really interesting. Again, looking at other industries, I think when DNA synthesis really came online, they had a similar challenge. And there was actually a lot of concern about ordering, let's say, the genome for a really dangerous pathogen, and then that can get to the wrong hands. And I was reading up on this. It's interesting. The industry really took the lead on trying to get out in front of these issues. And there was this interesting kind of international consortia on safe and secure DNA synthesis, which was actually pretty inspiring to think about, getting way out in front of these issues, talking about them, trying to anticipate these problems, and then teaming up and try to put smart, policies in place to really help mitigate prospectively some of these challenges. That seemed to make a lot of sense. That might be something we could learn from in our area.
Yeah, I think that's something we need to do sooner rather than later. The better, the safe and secure chemical synthesis. What kind of procedures do we have, and what kind of ethical constraints should we put in place as a community before something like a ghost gun gets printed, or we have who knows what chemicals running, drugs being sold on the streets.
Exactly.
Yeah. So what do we do? Because not everyone's going to have this skill set yet, right? You and I talk about this all the time and for years now. How do we put, get automation into our labs? How do we design chemistry? So that's another thing, if we're going to, the flip side of like, who should have access? Yeah, we have these perfectly reproducible procedures that are in the literature, but nobody can reproduce them because they don't understand the automation. How do we get to that? How do we get everyone involved, not just a small subset of people?
Yeah, no, I absolutely love this question. So, we always talk about this, right? There's like 7.5 billion imaginations out there in the world, and
more being born every day.
And as a field of chemistry, we are missing out on so many brilliant people who we have not successfully recruited into our field to leverage that amazing innovation potential. Sometimes very disruptive technologies are opportunities for fields to be shaken up, right? And there's a lot of barriers that exist in chemistry. Maybe this is a chance to shatter some of those barriers, right? And really open up the floodgates to that outsider effect into our field and get all kinds of new ideas flowing into chemistry problem solving.
Yeah, I totally agree. So, the question is then, how do we start introducing this into the curriculum, at high school, at college, at graduate school, so that people are prepared and feel fully confident in making use of all the amazing tools that automation can bring you, including the data analysis place. I always joke that I don't need to haul out a supercomputer if it takes me a week to make one compound, so I've got one dot on a graph. But once I can start automating and parallelizing, then, then I start needing some computational help. But this is not a skill set that we learned in grad school, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's another huge opportunity. It's a chance for us to rethink how we teach synthesis, and even more broadly, how we teach chemistry. I mean, in many ways, you always mention this, which I love the way you say this, is we've thought about organic chemistry as a weed out course, but it should be the exact opposite, right? Like a huge welcome mat into the field for all of these brilliant young minds that have so much to offer. And if we could figure out how to flip that, first of all, robots are cool. And so that gives us a good entry point. And then the other one that I really like is you know, again, we tend to focus on structure when we teach, and there's such a emphasis on this, but then these molecules do amazing things. And so given that robotics perhaps lowers those barriers to access on the synthesis piece, it's an opportunity for us to focus the teaching on function first and really try to think about capturing people's imagination. What do these molecules do? Right? And then how can we leverage the synthesis to get access to that function? And maybe that's a different way to approach kind of the teaching piece that gives us lots of opportunities to think differently on that front as well.
Yeah, I totally agree. The other thing, of course, is the automation allows the physical work of lab work becomes accessible to a much broader population, right? You don't have to be extremely good with your hands anymore if you can have a robot take over what you want it to do. And so it also opens up the lab part to a much broader swath of the population. If they're motivated to think about, why is it that you and I think these molecules are so cool? What's so cool about these molecules to begin with? Part of it is the beauty of structure, but of course it's also the fact that they can have really unique functions.
Awesome. Actually, imagine how amazing it would be if we could bring together 100 amazing people for a day and a half and just dream together about how we might teach differently and expose more people to these types of concepts. That would be pretty amazing.
Yeah, and just think about all the science we could think about. What could we do with all this automation? But, you know, look around. We've got smart people who've joined us this morning.
Awesome. We've got 100 Zoom bombers who seem also very interested in this topic. All right, that's fantastic.
Well, let's toast to that.
That sounds great. That sounds great. Well, I mean, then maybe we could have some, I don't know, since we've got everybody here, it might be really cool today to let's say we get some industry speakers who've really thought about this and had some time to experience in the real world what the challenges and opportunities are. Maybe we should just hear what they have to say. And then we'll let some academics who have a totally different perspective just kind of, you know, let us hear their thoughts on what challenges and opportunities they have. That might be a good way to spend our time. That
sounds like a great idea. So with that, maybe we should get started on this 1.5 days of fun.
That sounds good to me. Hey, Nikki, great to see you. Thanks.
Yeah, I look forward to more of these coffee chats. So with that, I'd love to introduce Rob Maleczka. He's a professor of chemistry at Michigan State University. He's a member of the Chemical Sciences Roundtable with me since 2018, and his research interests include the invention of green reactions and strategies for organic synthesis. He'll serve as the session chair and moderator for session 1 as we get started with the future of lab automation in industry.
Thanks, Nikki. Thanks, Marty, for a great way to start this workshop. As they suggested, we've got a great lineup of industrial speakers, academic speakers. We have great participants from all over the chemical community. And we're going to start with a session that is looking at the future of laboratory automation in industry. And I will start by introducing the panel members, and each of them will then give a brief introduction to their own perspectives and their own backgrounds as it relates to automation. I'll start with Dr. Spencer Dreher, who is currently a senior principal scientist at Merck with over 20 years of experience at the company. Dr. Dreher began his career in scale-up process chemistry and then moved into the catalysis group in the enabling technologies group, where he learned high-throughput experimentation chemistry and automation. He now works in medicinal chemistry. And so, Spencer, welcome, and we look forward to your participation in the panel.
Thank you, Rob. I understand that there'll be a slide shown. No? Oh, awesome, great. So, hi guys, thrilled to be here today. This is a really exciting workshop, and I think that it really shows you how much steam this sort of modernization of chemistry has. So as Rob alluded, I work at Merck, and I'm currently in the HTE, High Throughput Experimentation Group in MedChem. I think that the point of view that we take when we think about automation at Merck is that it's sort of a holistic affair. So in MedChem, if you think about our design, make, test cycle, you know, we want to be able to think about the kinds of molecules we want to make. We need to make them, and then we need to test them in biology. There's a whole lot of sort of moving parts in this process, from what kind of modalities do you take on in terms of peptides versus, small molecules or monoclonal antibodies, all kinds of things. We have automated chemistry tools, we have purification tools, analysis tools, design tools. All of these things are potentially data-rich opportunities where we can use these tools, we can generate information to benefit the project that we're on, but we're also thinking about all of these tools in the sense of trying to improve them in the process. So we're thinking about MedChem as an intentionally improvable system. When we take on a project, let's try to innovate and leave it in a better place for the next time we go through the cycle. So our focus is, in terms of chemistry automation, is on miniaturization and parallelization. So doing what we call nanochemistry, if possible, on the smallest scale we can. And then, of course, being able to do small scale purifications, to be able to do ultra high throughput analysis, et cetera, et cetera. All of this data-rich information, we hope to use machine learning to be able to improve our ability to make medicines, but also our process. So I look forward to the panel discussion this morning.
Thank you, Spencer. And another one of our panelists is Dr. Matt Bio. Matt is the president and CEO of Snapdragon Chemistry, a contract development firm that specializes in the design of continuous manufacturing technology. Previously, Matt worked at Roman Haas, the Burke Research Labs, and Amgen. He is driven by a passion for the development of new technologies that accelerate chemical development, enable safer, more efficient processes, and provide access to new molecular architectures. Matt, the Zoom is yours.
Thanks, Robert. Yeah, one of the things that Snapdragon works on is we take those molecules that Spencer and folks like him in discovery identify as potential new drug candidates, and we figure out how to manufacture those at scales that are necessary to take those into clinical and commercial supply chain. And here we're using novel technologies like continuous manufacturing to accomplish that. And if you've ever had opportunity to work in continuous manufacturing, it's characterized by there being many components that are all operating at the same time. It almost requires automation to be able to run continuous manufacturing efficiently. And so we've been focused on developing automation tools for manufacturing and for process development since day one of the organization. And one of the things that I think we're most excited about is a laboratory operating system that we've developed for automation that allows us to automate things like process optimization, process characterization, and then as we move into manufacturing, to be able to automate the process of manufacturing, even when it's early clinical development and the likelihood of making that molecule a second time is almost zero. Because a lot of those molecules don't make it forward. So what you need is very flexible automation platforms that don't cost a whole lot. Otherwise, you're going to slow down and add to the cost of drug development. So we are able to take advantage of newer technologies like single board computers and some novel automation platforms, programming platforms that are very graphically oriented and user oriented. To be able to rapidly put together highly automated systems for synthesis, even early on in manufacturing, when you're only trying to make a few hundred grams or kilos of material. The reproducibility of data that Nicola mentioned is critically important in process development. All of this information eventually ends up in the hands of regulatory agencies that are trying to decide whether we have good control over product quality. And having that reproducibility of data and that assurance that every time that process characterization has been run, it's been run in the exact same way, provides a high degree of confidence when we put data sets together to present to regulatory agencies, explaining the control of our processes. So automation is a critical tool for the advancement of pharmaceutical and fine chemical manufacturing. And I look forward to learning more about how others are using automation today.
Thank you, Matt. We're also pleased to have Dr. Benji Maruyama as a member of the panel. Benji works in the Materials and Manufacturing Directorate of the Air Force Research Laboratory, where he leads research on the synthesis and processing science of carbon nanotubes. His background and interests include carbon materials, carbon, polymer, and metal matrix composites, imaging of complex 3D microstructures, and combinatorial experimentation. Benji, give us your initial thoughts on automation.
Yeah, thanks, Bob, and thanks to Marty and Nicola for inviting me out. This is a great community, and I'm already having lots of fun. So from, I guess, just a couple of reflections on what Marty said, that it was more about function than structure, or really emphasizing structures or function over structure. And I work in the functional materials division, so that gives you a little bit of a viewpoint on where I stand. I think that one of the interesting parts about automation, and my particular area is really on autonomous research. So layering in autonomy onto automation, where robots are able to make sequential decisions about what to do next, essentially. But the thing about being in a big, well-funded lab, like many of us in academia and us in particular in the military lab, is we have access to great equipment and well-funded, state-of-the-art kinds of equipment with very smart people also. But as I think Nicola was mentioning, or Marty was mentioning before, there are lots of smart people, right? There's no limit on the number of smart people. The problem is really the access that those smart people have or do not have to doing research, to doing scientific research or chemistry. And so one of the things that we built in our lab is a low-cost, fully autonomous 3D printer. So it teaches itself how to print very simple structures using a very inexpensive printer, a Lulzbot printer in this case. And to make it even more accessible, what we've done is we've made the designs open source. We've made the software, our autonomous research system, Ares operating system, open source, so that anybody and everyone can actually take their turn at trying new 3D printing algorithms or learning how to print new inks. And I think by democratizing science, as Marty was saying, we now make it so that many more people have access to the ability to do their own research. So Marty mentioned 7 billion, right? So, and we scheme about maybe we can have a 1 billion scientist movement, so that our goal is to get that many people involved in doing scientific research. And so imagine the power unleashed by the ability of the entire society to do research as realized and enabled by autonomous research systems. So I think that for me is what we're very excited about. We're now working on a 3D printer that goes from $3,000 a copy to $300 a copy. And so just in the way that 3D printing essentially democratized manufacturing, right? It used to be if you wanted to make a complex part, you had to go out and pay for, pay thousands of dollars for a mold. Now you just, you go into a makerspace or someplace like that and print it up yourself. And so that's truly enabling. It's freeing of, it frees people to really do things that they can dream up and try things quickly at low cost, right? They don't have to invest their life savings into trying something. So I think that in itself really can change society and the way, the amount of impact that everyone can have on the scientific process. So with that, I think I'll turn it back over and thank everybody for their attention.
Thanks, Benji. And so our panel is then rounded out with Dr. Ying Wang. Ying heads the Advanced Chemistry Technologies Group at AbbVie, a centralized chemistry technology group for drug discovery research. Dr. Ying initiated and established the high throughput experimentation platform at AbbVie in 2017. There she is looking to leverage the proprietary ChemBeads technology and she invented along with her coworkers. Ying, your turn to introduce your thoughts on automation.
Good morning, everyone. It's really nice to meet all of you virtually. I enjoyed the discussion between Martin and Nikki this morning. Some of the great topics I have it here. Reproducibility, the benefit of automation will allow us to aim higher, centralized versus decentralized, and also in terms of the talent we want to recruit. These are great topics. I'm looking forward to discuss, expand the topics with everyone here. Just expand on what Rob just mentioned. So my group, we are a centralized chemistry technology group. So what we do is we have 3 pillar functions. One is high throughput library synthesis, high throughput experimentation, and also chemistry technologies. I define chemistry technology as any chemistry field that would leverage the implementation or benefit from the implementation of instrumentation, such as flow chemistry, even including photoredox chemistry, or high pressure gas mediated chemistry as well. So we leverage automation a lot because we work very closely with our automation engineering group. To give you some numbers, so we are a group of 16 people. Collectively, there are about 3 FTE, full-time employee working on the library synthesis. Although we only have 3 FTE compared to the almost 200 medicinal chemists at Abway, we register about 20% of the compound synthesized at Abway. So it's not, I used to tell people, it's not we work 24/7, it's because of automation. So that right there tells you the really significant advantage of having the automation in your workflow. And I also see some great questions on like how do we get the automation in a not prohibitive, expensive way. And to that, maybe we can expand on it later. I would say like that's kind of our thinking behind developing the Chemist technology. That's why that technology is slowly being picked up even in academic, because it doesn't require expensive automated instrument, rather small instrumentation would work. Well, with that, I'm looking forward to the discussion today and tomorrow.
Thank you, Ying. So we're going to now move to the discussion part of this panel. And in aiding me in that discussion is going to be Dr. Arslan Mirzafari. Arslan is an associate professor in the Department of Chemistry and Physics at Florida Gulf Coast University. His research focuses on the development of organic materials, which aims to address key societal challenges such as resources, energy, and medicine. Dr. Mirzafari serves on the workshop planning committee and will be joining the conversation. Specifically, Arslan is going to be monitoring the chat and will allow us he'll be then reading some of the questions from the chat that we can engage in as part of this discussion. I will also be looking at the participants list. So if you have questions, feel free also to raise your hand and we can, and I'll be able to call on you guys to ask your question verbally. And so Arslan, I do see we actually had a question early on in the chat that Ying referred to a little bit. And maybe could you read that question and get us started with our discussion?
Yes, absolutely. So it's a question about the centralized.
Exactly. Yeah. And
sophisticated automation. Can you comment on how to build a compelling financial case to make the investments in automation equipment, maintenance, and personnel?
Yeah, and Ying, you sort of touched on this, and so could you start with thinking about, how did you make the case for bringing automation to AbbVie?
Sure, I can start on that, and other people can chime in. So it's really interesting question. It's really a question I think dears to my heart. So the reason we developed the Chemist technology, I find that's a technology for dispensing the solid reagents in small quantities using the really dry powder coating technology, a technology used in formulation. So the reason we developed that technology is because we went to our management. we wanted a bigger automation investment, right? You are talking about millions of dollars of investment, and we got rejected upfront. It's very understandable because the management, they need to think about the strategy, like the rationale and the justification where you want to put the significant financial investment. So what we instead of doing is that actually in a way it forced us to look at solutions that does not require expensive equipment investment. And that's how we came up with the Chemist technology. I know that's not what the question asks, right? Like, so what I want to see is one part of this question is when you don't have the investment in huge budget commitment, maybe that's the kind of the drive to push you to come up with a simple, robust, reliable, small instrumentation that can actually be used, inexpensive, can be used by many people. That's one aspect to me, like to this question. Then the other aspect is once we develop the Chemist technology, we actually internally, we did the small experiment. We even get the older chem speed, many of you know that's a synthesizer, really old chem speed synthesizer to demonstrate our thinking works. You can do high throughput experimentation with this technology. And not only that, it really brings value to the company. Once you have that piece of data, even if it's small, it's much easier to secure the funding. And I'm glad to report here, we did get the state of the newest automated system for us to advance our high throughput experimentation effort. So I believe you really have to have some strong justification what the value it brings in, because also because of it generally requires really millions of dollars investment. You probably want to do it in several phases, right? You probably want to start with having some data in hand to justify the reason for making such investment.
Thanks. So the alternate view is so you have a centralized automation facility at AbbVie, but there was also talk between Nikki and Marty about having a sort of decentralized facilities, and this led to the conversation about democratizing synthesis, courtesy automation. And could the panel, and maybe Benji, maybe you could start. I think you already had some comments about the idea of democratizing synthesis through automation. Could you maybe pick up on that? And I invite, of course, the rest of the panel to do the same.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, it is that sort of decision where do you automate, do you put substantial amounts of money into automation, or do you use that same amount of money to do more experiments? And so if you look at a research organization, like ours, for example, we're mostly labor, right? We're labor driven, as opposed to say auto manufacturing, which is mostly equipment, right? Because it's now highly automated. And so I think if another anecdote, if you will, about the power of autonomous research is I had a couple of professors in my lab, and they got a week's worth of time on our Aries autonomous research system. And they came to me and said, Benji, in a week's worth of time, I did a dissertation's worth of research. So let that sink in a little bit. If you're able to do a dissertation's worth of research, so 3 or 4 years worth of research in a 1 week time, imagine the leverage that you have over labor. So I think that's transformative. And I think that really changes what you're willing to invest in. And getting back to the democratization side, absolutely. If you can have a maker space for making things, for tinkering and roughing out something and either making it for that one-time use or prototyping it for production, all of a sudden you've lowered the barrier so that lots of people can do things. You can have sort of an Etsy for building chemicals where it's really tailored to that person's needs. And that's super important, because now, again, the work that we do is mainly high impact kind of things that will hopefully help the world, right? And that's great, but that's only one aspect. There are lots of communities that have needs. Think of orphan drugs or those kinds of things where there's only, a small slice of population who cares about this, but they care about it very deeply. If you can reduce the barrier to entry, the cost of doing research and development by democratizing research, you lower that barrier to the point where those things are now doable for those communities. They don't have to have the big lab. They don't have to have lots of NIH funding. They can do things for their community, which it will be hugely impactful. And again, if things are networked and coordinated, they don't have to all be in the same place. They can have something that they're trying to develop for their local community. Maybe it's a coastal community doing algae development, but they can be helped by people all over the world who are interested and willing to contribute to that. So I see that model of doing research as extremely powerful and really look forward to that sort of becoming a thing in the future.
Right, thanks. So Matt, do you?
Yeah, I would just follow up on 2 points there. The cost doesn't have to necessarily be very high. We're a small company, and much of our automation began with single board computers that are available for tens of dollars. And a single board computer that can then be connected to any piece of equipment to allow communication back and forth through an HTML-based interface. And once you've started to do that, it doesn't take long until a few single board computers build up some seriously complex automation with existing lab tools. So I think the step to automating in the lab is not a huge cost barrier necessarily, given where the technology is today. The other thing, I think, building on what Benji said, is having that capability available over a network means that you don't have to have the flammable storage permits and all the safety interlocks and everything built in your own lab. You can actually maybe access a lab remotely and be able to utilize that piece of the infrastructure, which actually tends to be more expensive than building the automation infrastructure, is just building the infrastructure for handling large volumes of solvents and toxic chemicals. And so maybe democratization still requires centralized facilities, but accessible by anybody. It's sort of like what Benji was mentioning that they're doing in their lab.
So just to add to this discussion, I think that we're trying at Merck to do both, to have centralized facilities as well as to spread the tools out, and I think that's an important consideration. I think we need folks who are continuously trying to push what the tools can do, and then people who then you can kind of get it out into the hands of everyone. I think that if you have a single lab, you're gonna have a throughput problem potentially, right? You like to have tools that people can walk up to. The real problem becomes making it easy enough for people to use, and I think that that's a real problem in terms of all the training, which I'm sure we'll talk about later, but also the tools need to be built to the point where they become simple, right, to use, and that's a real problem. One thing that would help a lot is sort of pre-competitive and standardized approaches, so that different companies get behind the same tools to allow those tools to develop. One of the big problems we have is there's so many different platforms out there, and none of them are really well supported. In other words, they don't have a huge business, and so they can't hire the people that they need to make these tools simple for people to use. They continuously are difficult. So these kinds of, how do you build a lab? We need to be able to simplify the process. We need to share information more, I think, in a pre-competitive sense to help support the robotics and make it simpler.
So, Spencer, you just spoke about Merck having multiple approaches. Ying, Matt, Benji also spoke about different aspects of automation as they see it. Maybe we should actually take a step back here. And could each of you just give us a sense on how do you, as a representative of your particular industries, how do you define automation or specifically automation and synthesis, automated synthesis? And I'd be happy to have anybody shout out and start the conversation.
I'll just say, kind of as I presented at the beginning, we think it's holistic. It's not just automated synthesis. There's so many other associated tools that can also be automated. And so, but in terms of, sort of our approach, we certainly have process chemists doing automation as well. But my personal point of view is from MedChem, and it's really about trying to get integrated, really small scale experiments that you can use to make molecules, to test chemistry conditions, and then ideally provide as much information as possible to biology, right? We want to get more information per unit time to be able to move the biology, because even though chemistry is complex, biology is much more complex. So the more information we can get, the better. So that's really our approach. We're very much interested in things though, like autonomous synthesis. As Benji was talking about, one of our biggest bottlenecks is getting the sort of core structures in hand that we can do parallel synthesis on, and it can take a long time to get those molecules made. So if we can have faster approaches to making molecules at a larger scale, it will help us in MedChem as well. So I think it is holistic is really the answer.
Benji, I think you talked about autonomous and maybe you can expand upon how your research lab views automation and maybe even the incorporation of AI into automation.
Yeah, absolutely. So what we did is we started by automating our synthesis robot, if you will. So by automating, I mean that it's able to carry out pre-planned instructions. So for our case, it was looking at synthesizing carbon nanotubes by chemical vapor deposition. So practically that means being able to control mass flow controllers, lasers, microscopes, spectrometers. So saying, start taking this spectrum with these parameters. And so that's the automation part. What we then were able to do is actually turn that from an automated robot to an autonomous robot. And so the distinction there is that we have a planner, so that uses artificial intelligence and autonomy methods to take what was made in our system. So that could be, it could be a carbon nanotube, it could be a new chemical, or it could be a 3D print, and then analyze it. So you have to have an in situ diagnostic tool that says what just happened. So it could be, NMR yield from NMR, it could be image analysis for a 3D print or Raman spectra. And so that's the feedback signal, if you will. And where the AI and autonomy comes in is you now build up a database of what happened in the past. So I tried these conditions, this temperature, this pressure, this is what happened. It worked, it didn't work, along with a goal. So what is it that you're trying to get to? Are you trying to maximize, this particular wave number, this kind of yield, this kind of fill? So what is it? What is your objective within your campaign of experiments? And once you have those two things, then you bring in your AI planner, and AI is broadly defined. You can use statistical machine learning techniques. You can get fancy and use AI reasoning techniques. But really what it comes down to is knowing what I know, what would I try next to best get me towards my new objective. And so that's where it becomes powerful, because one of the ways that you can do is you can do it the old-fashioned way, where you're human in the lab pouring stuff, you try something, it works, it doesn't work, you go and do what's next, right? And that can take a day in iteration. You can do high throughput synthesis that can be massively parallel, and you can get a 96 well plate and get 96 answers in one iteration, but you're still left with that step of what to do next. And so the advantage of AI is that the algorithms are very comfortable in complex high dimensional space. You can do 100 dimensions if you like. You can make those kinds of decisions that are not typically what we do. What we're trained as scientists is, you hold everything constant, you change one variable, you make your plot of temperature versus output, and that's kind of your answer. But that's not the way complex systems really are, right? Which is what Spencer was just saying. It's like life is really complex, and so the research problems that we want to go after really start to require artificial intelligence and autonomy methods. And so with that, we've been able to do 10-dimensional optimization, find new, not just new knob settings, new ways to say, oh, this is the best set of temperature, pressure, whatever, to make carbon nanotubes, but also to test scientific hypotheses in line. So I believe that this is what's happening, some kind of Arrhenius behavior. That's a hypothesis, that's an objective. And so we directed our experimentation to figure out whether that was true or not true in the shortest number of experiments. And so I think the autonomous part of doing automated research is becoming recognized to be super powerful and kind of the way we would like to do research in the future, not just kind of what we're dabbling in right now.
Great, thanks. So Ying or Matt, do you have any additional comments about how you define automation in your respective industries?
I mean, building on what Benji said, I mean, we also use algorithm guided process optimization, where we can set an objective function and let the algorithm search that design space on a number of different process parameters. But then also in a different way, we use it in manufacturing. So being able to automate systems of safety interlocks very simply, so being able to do an assessment and saying, oh, we see a risk if the temperature here goes too high, and then being able to immediately say, if the temperature goes that high, stop this and do this. That allows us to build safety into processes without a whole lot of overhead in terms of having a programmable PLC or something like that needs to be there and programmed by an expert. Instead, we can use the simple automation systems that we're using in things like Node-RED is a common automation software platform that's pretty accessible to be able to put safety interlocks into manufacturing. So that's one way we use it that might be a little bit different than some of the others.
So yeah, I will. Go ahead.
One second, it's a comment in the chat section. It's just to think about the polymers, not just the drug design. Can just panelists address that?
So if I might, while I'm still on that, just build on that. So I think a lot of the things that we think of when we think of automation are these purpose-built platforms that are automated. So robotics and things like that built into a large-scale platform that then carries out an automation sequence. We don't think of automation in my organization like that at all. We tend to take off-the-shelf pieces of equipment and then use software to automate, as opposed to having purpose-built equipment. So that's what drives costs lower. It's not having very big integrated systems that are automated by some designer somewhere. It's actually being able to just use software as much as possible to automate while using all the tools that were in the lab before automation. And I would, in response to Gerard's questions on that, note that that's a way of going after inexpensive automation.
Yeah, so Ying, can you give us a little bit of sense on how AbbVie and how you define automation? And then we're going to move the conversation to, what does the panel see for the next 5-10 years? And when we move to that part, I'd like all of the panelists to think about where automation can play a role in the chemical sciences beyond drug discovery, as some of the chat has asked. So, but Ying, how do you define automation at AbbVie?
Yeah, apologies, I cannot comment on the polymer science, but hopefully what I'm going to talk about will have some resemblance for other disciplines in the chemistry sciences field. So I like to frame it under the, what was discussed this morning, decentralized and centralized, right? So if you think about automation in terms of decentralized, I do think that's a balance. In certain situations, definitely we should decentralize. And in certain situations, probably it should be centralized but accessible. So in terms of decentralized, think about this, right? I put it down like automated benchtop purification system right now is very common, which was not the case 15 years ago. Now almost no chemist in pharma industry at least packs their own column. And so to Nikki's point, I don't think anybody sits there diligently collect each fraction. Instead, the machine collects the fraction. The LC mass becomes so common, it's replacing the TLC plate as a primary tool, right, to detect the product formation. You can submit several samples at the same time, auto samplers for NMR characterization. All these are great advances. To me, these are can be considered as decentralized, and people can do, to Spencer's point, people can do at Merck apparently already, people can do like small, can do their own HTE on their benchtop, right, with the infrastructure already in place. That's kind of decentralized automated part at Abway as well. Then in terms of centralized, for example, we have TCAN instrument for all the liquid handling, for 96 plate, whether it's reaction screen or synthesizer compound, you do need some synthesizer, you do need more sophisticated instrument or customized instrument. UPLC, DASI, even photo redox, we evaluated all the instrument, whether you're doing it from a 10 mg scale to 5 gram scale, we have a centralized what we call discovery photo redox hood. So every chemist have access to it, and there's expert help them maneuver all the, learning how to operate the instrument. So in that sense, it's a centralized automation, because I don't see, each person will have a UPLC, right? That's too well funded, probably not necessary. Then there's also in between, to Max's point. We like to buy some off shelf. For example, gas mediated reactions. I don't know about other industry, but in pharma industry, it's centralized because the safety concern, it's high pressure, it's gas, can be toxic gas. So how do you dealing with a centralized facility, automated facility, while still allow bench chemists to use the automation that could allow them to do the gas mediated reaction themselves? That become a critical question. Many of you know, like we evaluated H-cube. Is this something everybody or every lab can have one? And I would think it's same thing with academic lab. Can each academic lab or institute have several of these accessible small instrumentation, simple, reliable, again, non-expensive, right? So this is kind of how automation works at Abway in the context of centralized and decentralized.
Right, thank you. So again, let's think to the future. There's a lot, I'm sure there's a lot of students, I know there's a lot of students on this workshop and who are aspire to careers in industry, where automation is clearly playing an important role. But think about, I'd like the panel to think about, 5-10 years down the road. What would you like to see in terms of chemical reactions, processes, methods that currently really don't lend themselves to automation? What are some of the areas that you would like to see chemists, perhaps the students on this workshop, think about developing those processes to make them more amenable to automation? What are the gaps in terms of traditional chemistry that has not yet been amenable to automation?
I could start the conversation, I guess. I think there's two things that I think are important to think about. One is it's not really an explicit goal of synthetic chemists to develop automation-friendly conditions, right? So a lot of the work we do in miniaturization, and this is certainly true for flow, would benefit from having reagents and such that are soluble and can be dosed as in solution. Inorganics, metals, that things like that become heterogeneous are a real problem to deal with. I think you can invent a reaction with whatever conditions work the first time, but you should eventually evolve the synthetic method to be automation friendly. And then you can really take advantage of it. The other thing I just have to make sure this gets said at some point, and it really is important, is our biggest bottleneck now is analytical, right? So we can do all of these experiments. We can run many, many more experiments than we can analyze. And so, you know, future folks who are thinking about how to enable automation, a lot of it is analytical. How can we measure whether a reaction worked or didn't work as fast as possible? One more sentence. I think the holy grail for us in terms of analyticals, can we calculate a yield for a reaction where we don't have a product standard in less than 1 second? That would be the best thing we could possibly have. So to all analytical chemists out there.
Benji, we have a lot of interest from the panel, the participants of the workshop on areas like materials and polymers. And as somebody who is interested in materials and polymers, where do you see the future of automation? What are some of the gaps that the automation that there still exists in terms of applying automation to materials science and polymer science?
Yeah, I would just amplify what Spencer was saying, that you know, knowing what happened, sensing or analyzing what happened is really the bottleneck. And so there's a couple different things that need to happen in that area. One is that they have to be automatable. So for example, think of a microscope. You know, sample exchange in a microscope is something that's easy for humans to do, but not so easy for robots to do. And ideally, we'd like it to have for it to be friendly to both humans and robots. Another part is the software control. So Matt was talking about that. I mean, right now, for the most part, you know, we're taking something that has, you know, software written for it. It might be, you know, an API, but a lot of our experience has been that the APIs are really not.
Uh-oh.
Hear me? My battery, for some reason, is not going. Can you guys hear me?
We got your back. Yep.
Okay, good. Hopefully I'll talk fast because I might run out of battery. So software, hardware, communications, just having everything be standardized over a USB port. I just was recently, you know, wrangling over a serial port, and we shouldn't have to do that anymore. But yeah, I think those kinds of techniques, and when you get into materials, you know, a lot of the chemical techniques, so NMR or some kind of a light response, those are relatively straightforward and accessible. But other things in materials are things like mechanical behavior. And so, you know, mechanically testing a material, pulling it apart or squashing it or looking at toughness, those kinds of things are really hard to automate. And it's going to require significant investment from funding agencies to really develop those into automatable processes. And so I see those as clear needs in the materials area.
So, you know, Matt and Ying, are there problems that industry is not working on right now that perhaps they would, whether it's a class of chemistry, a class of molecules, or are there problems that simply the industry doesn't have the ability to work on these problems right now, but that maybe automation would enable that?
I actually just want to comment on, I see in the chat, right, and Nikki mentioned to calibrate currently the H cube is out of the reach financially for academic labs. So right now you already have a problem to solve. So industry may not have the time, or it may not be the priority to come up with inexpensive, reliable, robust systems. And if H cube is out of the reach for academic labs, maybe the academic labs, right, like could come up with a inexpensive, reliable alternative, and that could be eventually probably commercialized or used by, you know, people can just hi, this is how you set up the high pressure gas reaction using the, you know, using the method or using the small instrument in academic development. And to that, I do have a story. So internally, diazomethane, everybody knows, many of you know, so this is a really very good reagent, but it carries really huge hazard, right? Chemical hazard. So generally, I don't think most of the people in pharma industry do not shy away from using diazomethane diazomethane. So internally, we spend years to have an automated diazomethane flow system. So allow us to have the diazomethane use the diazomethane in chemistry reaction. The interesting is, I believe several years back, there's a paper in Nature from academic lab. They reported a very simple way using tube-in-tube technology to generate the diazomethane in situ, which you can do it on literally in your own hood without much hazard. Any chemistry reaction has a certain hazard, but with really hugely reduced hazard. So that is a great example of how academic can look at the, all the hazardous gas, hazardous reactions to say, hi, this instrumentation is out of reach for my budget. And industry, it's a good, I know it's a good reagent, it's a good reaction. Could I do something in this field, right, to influence the development in this field, to come up with the instrumentation which all the institution can use? And that will be picked up very quickly. That's how we learned from our Chemist technology. Granted, it could be, we could drive the cost instrumentation down further if we had the time.
Yeah, so let's pick up a little bit more on some of the, maybe even the current drawbacks or shortcomings of automation. Matt, could you comment on, again, where you think there are certain drawbacks, some bottlenecks that currently exist that we'd like to solve?
Yeah, so two very different things. So one of them is just attracting the talent that has the capability to do automation to chemistry is a big challenge. We're competing against, software companies and Facebook and things like that that can attract that talent and maybe not even an awareness inside academia of automation's role in chemistry. And maybe that's contributing to the fact that we don't attract too much talent from that area. And then the other completely disparate area is around universal sensors that, if you want to, for us at larger scale, you want to see interfaces. You want to be able to understand where a liquid-liquid interface is. You want to understand when a bottle's full or versus empty. Having universal sensors that are indifferent to what's in the bottle, a liquid doesn't care if it's dielectric or not, has high dielectric constant or not, would be interesting. Maybe that's machine vision. That's certainly something that we're interested in. But that speaks to this other problem around automation and chemistry is the use of electrified equipment in flammable solvent environments is something that really, I don't know that we have great solutions for. We got big fume hoods that draw a whole lot of energy. And so in a world that's trying to be green, that's not a great solution. So I think innovation in that area of sensors and how we interface automation with chemicals is really an area ripe for some thought, some innovation.
Rob, we have a question in the chat. So I think the discussion, Mark Jones, I think the discussion around changing the approach to designing experiments has not been given adequate mention. Highly automated equipment is likely to be shared with campaigns being done. Weeks on the equipment may give data requiring months to analyze. His is far removed from the words of today's results influencing tomorrow's experiments. Can the speaker address needs for experimental design in this space? Is that clear, the question?
Yeah, I think it speaks back to Spencer's point about the challenge of analyzing the results. You can do reactions much faster than you can do results. I think that area around designing assays, much like it did for biology, becomes very important. How am I going to know what happened? And thinking about that before you actually go into the design around automation of the experiment, how am I going to ask that question? Since we already know it's a bottleneck. So that's really where it takes talent, is to design the right assay that goes along with the automation.
Yeah, if I could just comment, the distinction between autonomous closed loop approaches and say doing large batch experimental campaigns is that if you do lots of iterations, you're seeing what happened at each point. So imagine you're driving down a curvy road. You don't want to have one setting and go and see what happens, 2 miles down the road. You want to be constantly course correcting and seeing what's going on and taking into account all of the new results that you have. And so the advantage of closed loop is that you have lots of iterations. And so my mantra is that lots of iterations beats lots of experiments. And that gets to design of experiments. When, design of experiments in the classical sense of, you have a budget for 100 experiments and you want to maximally span parameter space to capture as much of that response as possible. That's what you do when you have one iteration, right? That's what you do for an iteration. When you have lots of iterations, what you do is you say, okay, what experiment or set of experiments can I do to get me the closest to my goal as I can, understanding that I'll have lots of iterations in the future. So that really changes your experimental design approach and the way you think about constructing your new experiments. And the other point, again, is just to reinforce that rather than say naively optimizing a response, whether it's functional or yield or something like that, what you can do is you can optimize against a hypothesis. You might say, this is the, the active, this is the bottleneck in the reaction steps. So if you pose that as a hypothesis, what experiments can you design at each iteration that will get you that answer, confirm or negate that hypothesis in the shortest number of iterations? And so that's a change in mindset for how we design experiments.
I'll just be very mildly contrary to that. I would say that you can one up that idea by being able to run many parallel experiments with many iterations, right? Why
absolutely.
not just do what you just described massively in parallel? The problem is analytics. We don't have the ability to know what happened that quickly.
Yeah, and just to make one other point on analytics, in materials testing, for example, just to give this as an example I know a little better, often what we want is the gold standard ASTM standard test for mechanical properties. And that's what we trust, that's what we design to, that's what we fly on. But that's a hard test to get. And you can do an indentation test at a fraction of the cost. You can get a lot more results, a lot more answers, and it's cheaper, but it's not the standard, right? So the question then becomes, do you get enough information out of that cheap, quick, dirty test to get you to the point where it's worth going off and doing the expensive ASTM standard test? And so again, we have to change our mindset and how we approach these kinds of problems. Sometimes it's better to do the quick and dirty, get something to the point where it's like, oh, okay, I think this is going on and it's worth taking, a couple days to do those expensive tests.
So we have a hand raised from one of our workshop participants, Don and Johnny. You have your hand up. Would you like to ask a question of our panel?
Question.
You're
So
muted.
do you able to hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So I'm a graduate student and I'm working on automating pH synthesis. Okay. And then we're like getting good results and all, and we're talking to these companies, but they really don't want to use the technology. So there's a gap between those two. So I would like you to address the gap. And the other problem we are facing is we're unable to find money. But I know there's the money is in the industry, but they're like very profit oriented, but they really don't want to change what they're doing. Am I expressing myself okay? Okay, so that's my question, kind of comment. Thank you.
Panelists?
I could just say that you're seeing just that a lot of industrial companies and scientists are very conservative, and so there's a tried and true method for doing everything. And in our own world, someone will invent some new process or technology or automation, and it's very hard to get other people to do it. So the whole field has to move forward in terms of accepting automation, accepting new ways of doing things. And honestly, the best thing that could happen is that that starts in school, where people are already open-minded about trying all these things. They come into their new jobs and they're willing to try new things. So yeah, that's a simple answer. It's just this, we face the exact same problem internally.
Yeah. So to add on Spencer's comment, I agree completely. So you can always try next year, then the year after, to see if you can get to the, I agree with Spencer. Generally, people are very conservative and they want to make sure the technology they are they are acquiring or collaborating with the company or the group they are collaborating with is worth the investment, right? So maybe again, go back to, you know, like the really generate a strong data rationale or justification. Then coming back again, I see companies come back year and after year with new development or ask the question again, the dynamic may change.
Rob, we have a question.
Sure.
Jane,
Well, so Dejani, do you have a follow-up question, or is your hand still raised from before?
Well, it's a follow-up question. So the technology is developed, like the method is developed like 2 or 3 years ago, and we've proven that we're getting good results like over and over, but still they're reluctant to use that. So even, for instance, we talked with a really big company and we know that they have money, but they want us to do more research on that thing, but they're not providing any money or anything. So it's like, we don't have money in academia to like do all those things. And we don't have time either, because a student will stay here for like 5 years and that's about it. So I don't know how we are going to address those gaps between the industry and academia. I think, in my opinion, the most important thing is to like link those two together. So then we will be able to see a bigger change faster. Thank you.
Yeah, I think what unfortunately what you're experiencing is an issue of risk. That for a company to, you know, take on and commercialize your process, they have to, as you said, invest quite a lot of money. And so one of the things is, again, getting to the maker movement. How can we reduce risk in a cost-effective way, so that, you know, you say, you know, so that you can get to the point where the company has the confidence that is the, you know, that the risk is essentially factored out to the point where they're willing to make that investment. And so hopefully, you know, that's part of not just doing the research, but doing the industrial processes where we can get that transition pipeline de-risked, so we can eliminate or reduce the amount of risk at a reduced cost. I think that's really transformative then.
Arslan, I think you made a suggest we have another question from the chat.
So yeah, it was a comment in terms of funding. Philip from the Beckman Foundation. So he put it in the chat that the Beckman Foundation is considering a funding call in this domain for the super exciting direction. So they are considering doing that. So we have a question. Find it. Yes. So Jane asked, the challenge they have is pushing this technology to front-end innovation. Can the panel discuss approaches to automation into unknown/new technology in chemistry/formulation? But if a science completely new, a technology is completely new, how we can implement automation in that field?
I guess one point about that, the issue about research, especially in materials, is that sort of by definition, we change what we do all the time. We might do something for, you know, set up an experiment for a week, a month, a year, but then we're constantly changing it. And if you're doing that in an automated way, each time you change that automated process, that takes a lot of work and a lot of money. And so one of the challenges of building in automation and autonomy in a research process is to have that flexibility where you can change something, add a new step, add a new analytical tool. As Marty was saying, maybe having your Lego brick approach process. And so that it doesn't take, you know, a week, a month, a year to change that setup, because if it takes that long, then you're likely not to do it.
Yeah, building on what Benji said, I think those automation tools, those software tools that are really user accessible and can be done by non-experts. So automation by non-experts through some of these software tools is really important to being able to make it accessible and used.
I also want to add to this, also to the question we were talking about earlier. I feel like also automation, you need to think about your audience or the context of the request. So Benji, you mentioned like I put down like a quick and dirty experiment. So for example, you really have to think about the purpose of the problem you're trying to solve in designing your experiment. For example, from the farmer perspective, are you working with a med chemist trying to just come up with a condition, for example, reaction condition to make the analog? Who cares if whether it's 30% yield or 40% yield? I just want that compound to be made fast, like today. So in that case, you design your experiment in ways of maximize the chance of finding the hit with like 30 mg, 30 reactions, so you don't have to do the lengthy analytical process. On the contrary, if you are in, for example, in process chemistry, you try to optimize a condition. You try to see, I want to get the yield from 85% to 99% yield, then you probably need more detailed, different ways of design the experiment, so that way you can get to the point you wanted, probably more elaborated with lots of experimental plan. So I see a couple questions on the experimental design and automation. I feel like this is really dependent on what question you are trying to address, right? And if you want to do the AI, you want to do the machine learning, you need negative data points. And that's something you want to think when you design your experiment. So there's no one size fits all.
I think it's important to say as well that, you know, automation is really good at doing simple things over and over and over again that it knows how to do, and not really good at doing new things. And that's something that, you know, to Matt's point earlier around sensors and stuff, being able to get them to be able to be more agile is important. I know there's some research going on that I've, you know, read about where they're getting, you know, automated systems to be able to reconfigure themselves depending on the process they're trying to accomplish. But that stuff is all very, very new technology. And I think you just need a general improvement in robotics and, you know, autonomous, you know, sort of thinking to be able to do a new experiment. Typically what we do is offload all the easy old stuff, and then we do the new stuff with our hands. That's the way it ends up working out.
So I have a sort of maybe another take on this question of experimental design. A while back, there was this discussion that certainly in terms of synthetic targets for example, drug discovery, there was a lot of targets that were selected in part because they were amenable to cross couplings. And can we maybe talk about this? Do you see any sort of bias along those lines where the synthetic targets now are being defined more by the automation as a tool to access those targets than perhaps, let's say, is healthy?
Rob, you are correct. I do think automation play a huge role in, at least again from a farmer perspective, in terms of what reactions we use. I mean, it's no secret that there's several publications on that, perspectives on it. Like over the last 2 centuries, the farmers still, the medicinal chemists still rely on a handful of more highly prevalent chemistry to make the final drug. And I could also tell you, like to my earlier point, if we use automation to make up 20 to 25% of the compound registered at ABWI, and these are the really parallel amenable transformations. So this including really the cross couplings, amide formation, reduction, elimination, all these very commonly seen reactions. So indeed, I agree, like automation, improve the throughput, make the work more highly efficient. At the same time, it also has the risk of I guess bias the easier chemistry or routine chemistry on this platform. And to that, I would strongly advocate, right, like industry and academic, for example, again, go back to the H-cube type life instrument or diazomycin-like instrumentation, and even photoredox instrumentation. I know at some companies like Merck, right, it's used routinely by every medicinal chemist, but that's not the case in a lot of companies. Well, it carries a huge advantage, but it does in the instrumentation.
There's another way to think about that though, and I think Marty's actually talked on this in the past, is if you think about a privileged set of reaction types that you can do in automation, is it a large enough set that it can answer all the functions that are required for those molecules? So yeah, it might be biased that we only make certain types of bonds, but is that design space large enough to actually answer all the functionality that we're seeking out of these molecules? And I think that could be an interesting area of research, actually. And I know I'm doing Marty disservice, but I know he's spoken on this before really eloquently, and I'm not presenting it quite the same, but I think that's an interesting concept, because if you look at proteins, I mean, it's all the amide bond. It does a whole lot of different things. And maybe there's privileged classes that we can go after that allow us to access all the functionality we want in, say, pharma, with a smaller set of reactions.
Matt, I'm so glad you bring up that topic. That's really a valid point. In fact, there's paper on like, okay, maybe we cover enough for chemistry space, right? But again, that's related to pharma, just with a handful of reactions. Actually, an interesting comment from Derek Law in the pipeline blog is, nature made wonders with only a handful of amino acids, right? So why should we need more than that? I mean, there's argument on both sides, but that's a very interesting perspective.
I think just to add a little flavor to both sort of discussions around this topic, I think one thing is there's not so much automation going around that I think it's automation that's affecting the molecules we make. It's more about the success of the chemistry. Right? A lot of these things are just simple people making one molecule at a time in their labs, but they gravitate to the same methods. I do think that there will be some pathology related to automation at some point and how we use it. I'm a big fan of exploring all of chemical space. I think IP argument alone, right? As soon as everybody can just take all commercial building blocks and make everything in one step, which won't be that far off, then we'll all be making the same molecules. So we're going to need to move into chemistry space to have room to move. But I think also if you're going to go towards someday having personalized medicine, you're going to need a whole lot of molecules that look very similar but interact with your body, in different, the specific person's body in a specific way. And that's something that's going to require chemistry space as well. So I agree it's a good starting point to be able to rapidly use these easy reactions, but I think we're going to need everything.
So let me ask in a very specific way for our panelists. If you could share, again, those of us in academics, what are reactions or reaction types that right now really don't lend themselves to automation that you would like to see developed in that way? And I'm going to take some notes.
I can start with one which I probably already mentioned several times, really the parallel, for example, parallel debenzolation, parallel nitro reduction in small scale. At least from what we surveyed so far, I don't think there's any commercial instrument or internally we have a good way to do that at a small scale, let's say 10 mg scale in safely and easily in a 96 format. Like 6-plate format. That's one.
So homogeneous reactions are obviously much easier to run. You don't have a third phase that you got, a solid phase that you've got to worry about, surface effects, all those kind of things. I mean, just in general, heterogeneous reactions are harder to scale, even in batch. And if you want to automate things, it's much easier to move liquids around. And so figuring out ways to do things in homogeneous systems is certainly advantageous for automation.
And I will add one on photoredox. So photoredox, there's a suite of instrument commercial or internal design available. But in terms of the scale up, I believe most of the folks in pharma still rely on flow chemistry for photoredox scale up, let's say 100 gram. But flow, again, to match the point, you run into the solubility issue. So what are the ways to scale up a photoredox when you did the initial reaction in flux to flow without having to worry about the precipitation at large scale?
So Benji, in the materials space, there are certain types of reactions that right now just don't lend themselves to automation that you think could be the next area of study?
Yeah, I would say, I think it was mentioned in the chat even, anything that involves image analysis, it's hard to get into the workflow. I already talked about things like mechanical testing. That's still very much done by students or technicians, and for good reason, right? If those tests are not done right, then especially in something that's a qualifying campaign for a material, it can have real consequences in flight worthiness, for example. But I would say, yeah, those kinds of human intensive processes, and also some that still are not easily interpretable by humans. So I mentioned image analysis, but even just spectral analysis, there are still points where you need the human in the loop to say, yeah, that's a real peak, or no, that's not a real peak. And so one of the interesting things I learned in interacting with the autonomy community is the goal is not to get the human out of the loop, right? The goal is to produce teams of human and robot researchers, so that when you have those kinds of issues, for example, it's been looked at for analyzing X-rays for breast cancer, that doctors on their own are very good. There are now automated techniques that are also very good, but better than both of those are teams where you use both the human expertise and the automated or autonomous systems expertise.
So let's actually move the discussion a little bit. And when Nikki and Marty began, they talked about jobs. And one of the things that we're hoping to gain from this workshop is a better understanding of how we should incorporate automation into our curricula. And part of that is because of training. And so I was wondering if you guys could speak to how automation has changed in terms of how you look for candidates, look at candidates for positions within your company, or has it? And so if you could speak to how automation has influenced or not influenced the hiring process.
So certainly we look for folks that are interested in being able to use automation. I mean, that's certainly not every chemist training background coming out of school would immediately think about automation, because they probably hadn't been exposed to it. But that openness to introducing instruments into your process and getting away from traditional round bottom flask type of approach to graduate school synthetic chemistry is really important. So we tend to attract folks that like to tinker, that are used to getting their hands wet with hardware, and are not afraid of a little coding either, because a lot of that also plays well. But I think the thing that's really different, in just thinking back to my experience from graduate school some 20 odd years ago, and then the way I moved into industry and how industry worked, was really cross-functional collaboration. And that's what we've tried to build here, is groups not of chemists that have all these skills, but the individual skill holders all working together as small teams. And I think that putting together chemistry and chemical engineering folks in projects in graduate school and undergraduate could be really interesting, because I didn't get much exposure to chemical engineering until I got out into Merck, where I met chemical engineers and they worked with me on my project, and I learned from them over the years. And that exposure early on to areas like chemical engineering, how software is used in certain environments, even analytical chemistry. I think, I went to Columbia and I didn't have a lot of access to analytical chemists, not like the bigger state schools that might have analytical chemistry as a discipline, and didn't fully appreciate how important analytical chemistry was to the solution until getting out into industry. So those interdisciplinary teams, even in academia, could be a really good training ground for what's going to happen when they move into industry.
Spencer, would you like to comment on the
Sure. Yeah, no, everything Matt said is exactly right. I'll say that the teams that Matt is talking about it's an interesting, sort of dynamic, because you do have to have some domain knowledge to be able to communicate appropriately. So a lot of times you have these teams, but there's not enough common ground to actually have a real conversation about the need. And so the extreme example is if you're trying to convince a coder or something, you need something built and they just have no idea, which is very common, right? Someone's going to develop something for you and they have no idea what what chemistry is. So people who have those kind of cross-functional skills themselves to be able to facilitate, I always like to think of it almost like a liberal arts kind of thing. You want to come in. Certainly you need to solve some complex problem as a PhD to show you're a good problem solver, but the more diverse your skills that you have yourself, the more likely you'll be able to sit on that team and add value, real value, right? Basically run the team, make sure everything is smooth. Having said all that, I think, I would encourage everybody to get like a domain knowledge in some hard science and then coding, data science degree as well, like a dual kind of thing. And then that's going to set you up pretty well. But the tinkerers is big, right? People who just are fearless to go in and muck around is so important to pushing these things forward.
Ying, any thoughts on in terms of when AbbVie is looking at applicants?
Yep. So I agree completely with what Matt and Spencer just mentioned. I believe if you are applying for a chemistry job, obviously you need to have strong domain knowledge, which is chemistry. So the chemistry is still fundamental. But for what we are looking for, having more diverse experience, for example, you did your postdoc in a different discipline, or as a master of a PhD student, you expanded the research scope of the group you were at. Curiosity, flexibility, and willingness to step out of your comfort zone. These are the things we look at. And to Spencer's point, I think there's a huge need or demand for people who have the strong domain knowledge, which is chemistry, but at the same time have sufficient knowledge in either in engineer, automation engineer, or in coding, as data scientist. This type of talent is hard to come by. Like I'm actually experiencing right now. So we work with the IT or the cheminformatics group who don't understand chemistry, and we don't understand the coding. So how do we bridge that gap? It's very difficult. And another point I want to make is in industry, there's really a project that does not require teamwork, to match this point. In fact, most of the time you require cross-functional collaboration. So you really need to speak other people's language. How do you see the project from other people, other disciplines, perspective? How do you influence people without any authority? All these skills become equally important in addition to your scientific field, which is chemistry in our discussion. So that's all I have.
If I want to highlight the value here is from the discussion between Matthew and Spencer, that coding is not necessary for the chemistry graduates to join the chemical industry. As long as they know they are willing to learn, the rest is not very important. Is that correct?
Yeah. I
Yeah.
believe that's correct. Yeah.
Yep.
You can take a crash course once you start your job.
Mhm.
You have to have the willingness to learn it, though. That's the key.
Yep.
So yeah, maybe you can also then describe just briefly, at least, that aspect of it, and that is when you do have people who were not trained in data science and were not trained in automation, but are interested and open. I mean, how much training is actually involved, and how is that actually conducted, that training?
Right. Yeah, I think you find in any industry job that that they, there are changing needs, right? And they will continuously retrain you in anything that's valuable to the company at basically at the company's expense, to follow what's needed. So if we need more coding, then we will get more folks trained up. So, a lot of it is, it's just, kind of, we've identified you, you've identified yourself as a person who wants to learn this. We even have internal training courses, or it could be an external course that you go to, and it just becomes part of your development. So you'll spend 6 months or a year doing some new training exercise, and then you have a new skill. So that's very much a part of sort of the industrial experience.
And we've also, partnered different disciplines together on projects to work very closely, so that there is that training of each of them by the other to be able to speak the common language and to go after a problem. So in our labs, we've got people that are dedicated to just programming. They were trained as computer scientists, and they're working very closely with a chemist. And if something about the software is not right, the chemist can go walk into his office and pull him in there and say, hey, can you change this? It's not operating right. And this should be a pull down menu here, and go back and do that. And so keeping that very tight loop, not having them in a separate building or something like that, but keeping them in the same facility, in the same lab, and really encouraging them to solve that problem together is what brings out in others, hey, I'm interested in that. I want to learn more about it. I want to go to a course on, ladder logic or Python or something like that, and get more information about it. And I think part of it is on the side of management is to just let people explore a little bit, let them get out of their comfort zone. They're not going to get it right the first time. It's not going to be as efficient as if I had hired an expert that could do that, but they're going to have the dual domain knowledge that's going to let them get to a solution later on faster than if I had hired an expert in the area. So I think that's the important thing, is we've got to step back and let people explore a little bit and find their niche.
Yeah, I would just add, agreeing with what everybody said previously, that it is, even if you're not doing the coding yourself, even if you're, the chemistry domain expert sitting back, you certainly need to have an appreciation for, what kinds of algorithms are out there, and their limitations and benefits. So, the kinds of things where we talked about the naive approaches, which don't know anything about chemistry or physics. Early on, we had an algorithm that wanted us to try a negative absolute temperature, right? That didn't make any sense at all, but we hadn't coded it in there. But understanding what, how algorithms work and what they can and can't do well, I think is just sort of a minimum appreciation for what needs to be done.
So as we sort of begin getting close to wrapping up this session, I want to sort of use this panel to help us transition into the next topic, and that is going to be, again, looking at automation in academia. You've all been trained, presumably, in more traditional curricula where automation was not part of the laboratory courses that you took, either as an undergraduate or even as in your graduate careers. And so, based on what you do now with automation and your knowledge of, let's start at the undergraduate level, the undergraduate courses you took, maybe in an advanced synthesis lab or analytical lab, how would you recommend those of us in academics think about incorporating? What level of automation would you like to see incorporated in our undergraduate labs, if any?
I'd be happy to start the conversation. To start with, maybe I've been out of school for a long time. So instead of maybe let the student set up one reaction, they can set up parallel reactions in a plate format. And Spencer probably have more on this, like in terms of reaction optimization or even parallel ways of doing the experiment. And that does not really require, to be honest, any or very minimal investment in instrumentation, more like a mindset change. And I'm not the expert on that, but Matt can comment on it. So maybe a simple flow setup. I know, folks in my group, they have set up very simple flow, kind of like a syringe pump type of, just to see how we do a simple reaction in flow. So chemists, students are aware of, oh, there's a flow technology, you can run the reaction in flow. Not really formally, but informally, we always welcome the high school students or even and undergraduates, graduate students to come to visit, right? In every industry, maybe you can schedule some visits. So they talk to the industry folks, and not only pharma, like polymer sciences, chemical companies, to see how the automation plays a role in real life, in action too.
Yeah, I think you raised an interesting point. I think continuous manufacturing or continuous flow processes are only a small fraction of all chemical reaction space, but they're interesting because they almost require automation to be able to run. And so it is an interesting, thin edge of the wedge to introduce that in the chemistry labs, to maybe get folks thinking, hey, there's tools I can use that are a little bit different than the round bottom flask that I thought it was going to be, to do chemistry as well. And I think MIT actually has been innovative here in introducing continuous manufacturing in their undergraduate classes as part of the labs. But that, even if it's not for the continuous part of it, but just for the fact that you have to use some sort of automation to be able to run these reactions, that in itself is interesting enough. And then to be able to use that platform to maybe introduce a sensor and say, oh, you got to measure things when you're doing chemistry. Let's try to do that in real time. And how can we put that data together with what's happening elsewhere in the reaction, what the pumps are doing, what the mass flow controller's reading, what the balance is changing in real time, and how does that information help us understand stoichiometry? And I think that would be a really interesting way to introduce it, even if flow is not the aim. That's, it's just another tool, but just showing that scope of tools that are available to do chemistry.
So I think that's a great lead-in. So let's wrap this session. If everybody could just give me, or give us your final thoughts in, let's say, 30 seconds to a minute. And Ying, could we start with you?
Sure. So let me start. So I feel like lab automation no doubtly has the potential to change fundamentally how chemistry is carried out in lab. Let's just have this dream: the day when every bench chemist, whether in industry or academic, utilizes a suite of lab automation in their daily synthesis, just like the way we use the smartphone in our daily life, like right now. Then at that point, I guess we can confidently say that lab automation is an integral part of chemistry synthesis. It really fundamentally changed the way how we do synthesis. And I believe that it will come. It just need a huge commitment and a really solid planning.
Great. Spencer?
I love something that Benji was talking about earlier about the human and machine sort of synergy. I think that we need to learn to use enabling technologies to make ourselves better, things that we can't do as a human to work to be able to do those things. And I think the result of that is going to be a much better business at the end of the day. I think that we've gone through a phase where we saw what happens if we don't modernize. And for synthetic chemistry, it wasn't a great moment. I think the tools that we're developing are going to be what allows us to actually have much better business. And we're going to have many more synthetic chemists in the future than we have now because we use automation.
Great. Matt?
Yeah, I think it's a fantastic time for chemistry. It's really exciting to be able to use all of these new technologies in the delivery of what we do. But I think the other side of that, and it was touched on early on, is democratization of chemistry, and to look at organic synthesis as a tool that others outside of chemistry can use. And how can we give them the tools to be able to access organic chemistry? And I think that's where really interesting things are going to start to happen. You know, how can I open up the tools of synthetic chemistry to somebody who's not an expert but is looking for function, and how can we work together to solve their problem? And I think the more that we do that, the more central synthetic chemistry will become to solving some of the world's problems.
Thanks. And Benji?
Yeah, so it's a great discussion, really appreciate it. There's a challenge and an observation by Professor Hiroaki Kitano in Japan. So he noted that scientific discovery is at the pre-industrial revolution level. So that's really damning. If we were farmers, right, we would be farming with hand tools and oxen, whereas nowadays farmers farm with combine harvesters, so lots of automation, but also intelligence. So they're GPS guided and AI informed about what they do. So really, if we think about our future, it's really about transforming what we do as researchers, as scientists, as industrial chemists, from that hand operation to really thinking about it at a higher level and how to work together with our now post-industrial revolution scientific tools. And so his challenge is when will an AI scientist win the Nobel Prize? And so I think that that's been really motivating for me, and I hope that it's motivating for others to get into the field.
Thank you, Benji. And on behalf of the entire workshop, I'd like to thank Drs. Dreher, Pohl, Maruyama, and Wang for a great discussion on the industrial aspects of automation. And so I ask that all of the participants join me in giving them a Zoom round of applause. So now just for a couple of logistical points. So we will be taking a 15-minute break. We'll encourage everybody to be back at 10:45. In addition, during the 15-minute break, there will be 2 polling questions that will be available on your Zoom screen. This is not a scientific poll. It is only intended to promote further audience engagement and participation. Note that the responses reflect opinions of individual workshop participants and are not the opinions of the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. The polls will close at 10:45 once session 2 begins. So we'll be taking a break. Please come back at 10:45, but in between, take advantage of the 2 polls that will be available on your Zoom screen. And thanks again for everybody's participation.
For those of you that participated in the poll, thank you for participating. We decided to open this up with some questions about implementation of automation in academic departments, as well as industry. So the first question was, how many people of the audience have it currently? And it was pretty evenly split between department-wide, centralized facilities, individual groups, and then a combination of both. And then about 30% did not have any facilities currently available. And the other question that we're interested in finding out is the reasons why. And I was only given the option to do a single choice for this poll, but it would have been really good to see the ranked questions, because I think probably some places are in a situation where more than one answer would apply. So 46% said that cost was an issue. Lack of broad interest was around 10%. Unable to agree on how to implement it was also around 10 to 12%. And then lastly, resistance to change was 30%. And I'm disappointed, but not entirely surprised to see the relatively high number that said the main reason was resistance to change. So this panel is going to focus on the use of automation in academics, and we're going to have a number of panelists from both undergraduate and graduate institutions, as well as from the NSF. And the format for the panel will be very similar to the previous panel. We will have each panelist give a quick 2-minute introduction to what they do, and then go into the questions, and that will include responses to the point-counterpoint, responses to anything in the previous panel that caught people's interest. And then we have some additional questions. So my name is LaPointe. I run a small high throughput center at Cornell University. And prior to being at Cornell, I worked at CIMIX for 13 years. And so my research interests are focused on catalyst development and polymer chemistry. In the chat, in the previous session, we had some discussion of implementing high throughput in a variety of settings and not having everything be very pharmacentric. So I'm very excited to have a number of panelists with a range of backgrounds. And Nicola Pohl is going to be assisting me with the panel. She was part of the Point-Counterpoint at the beginning, but for those of you that missed the first part of the meeting, she's a professor at Indiana University, and her research interests are in development of synthesis and analysis of carbohydrates and glycopeptides. At this point, I'll start bringing in the panelists, and then they'll have their 2 minutes to give their introductions. Klavs Jensen is the Warren K. Lewis Professor of Chemical Engineering and Material Science at MIT, and his research interests include methods for automated synthesis, machine learning techniques for chemical synthesis, and the interpretation of large data sets. Klavs, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Will there be a slide? Okay.
Yeah.
So just as Benji and my interests have also expanded into autonomous systems, although I think we should be very careful with how we use the word autonomous. Just because you have a radio controlled car doesn't mean it is autonomous. But in terms of what we talk about with automation, we've been very interested in flow, multi-step synthesis, automation, and robot configured systems as a way of really implementing this. We've also worked with droplet-based systems for screening, and those you can both do thermal, photo, and electrochemistry. And most recently, we worked on a 96-well plate platform built around sort of standard liquid handler with additional robots to allow us to essentially have a closed loop system in which we can use AI to define the molecular target, use our computer synthesis planning tools to actually plan the synthesis, then have the robot execute it, and then actually synthesize the compounds, characterize them, and so on. And I want to echo Spencer's earlier comment about analytical techniques and all the work that we've done over the past couple of decades on automation. I think our biggest frustration have been dealing with the analytical vendors in terms of letting them actually access their software. I think it's also some of the things we talked about before, really critical to have multidisciplinary teams that work on these, people who are really good at the computer science part and people who are very good at the mechanical engineering part, and then people that sort of know how to integrate it, and of course, people who know the synthesis, the chemistry. And so, again, we can stop here and I'll be glad to go to the next.
Thank you very much. Our next panelist is Lee Cronin, and he's the Regius Professor of Chemistry at the University of Glasgow. And his research spans many disciplines and has 4 main aims: construction of an artificial life form, digitization of chemistry, use of AI in chemistry, including the construction of wet chemical computers, and the exploration of complexity and information in chemistry. And Lee, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. It's great to be with you virtually. What we've been trying to do the past few years in Glasgow, pertinent to this, is kind of work out if it's possible to standardize chemistry in such a way that we can get more access in a pre-competitive way. And one of the things we've been kind of coming up with is a universal abstraction for chemical synthesis that we call computation. And computation is not really a fancy word. It's just supposed to be the same thing as computation. And think about computation as take a code, some reagents, produce a product, our product profile, and how can we make that standard every time? Well, these rather big arrows, I think they translated into the PowerPoint rather badly, but that's kind of, maybe they're my extrovert arrows. To abstract chemistry, you just need to do 4 things. You need to have the abstraction requires you to have a reaction followed by a workup and then a separation, purification. Wire those 4 things together and you should be able to make anything. And so what we try to do to make a state machine that would literally implement this abstraction from a high level and a low level, chemically, mechanically, in a chemical engineering sense. So we have built a state machine that is run using a chemical programming code, which has now become a kind of Turing complete language, which requires a graph and a hardware standard, but allows you to kind of verification. But the good thing about this approach, which I just want to mention today, is it gives you interoperability. The code is universal and it removes ambiguity. And we've made this an open standard. We're going to give it away. I'm hiring 4 software developers that are working with collaborators. Some of you are here, many other collaborators in industry. And my question is really, how do we make sure that we can use this kind of standard to help us exchange chemical code that will run, make a molecule on any robot in a standard way? And that's one of our kind of stated goals, is to get to this kind of holy grail and to make it easier for us to swap chemistry, use machine learning, and to accelerate adoption, whether it's networks of chemical robots or big facilities, it doesn't matter. Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you so much. Moving on, Andy Cooper is the academic director of the Materials Innovations Factory at the UK Research Partnerships Infrastructure Fund and the director of the Leverhulme Center for Functional Materials Design. His main research interests are organic materials, supermolecular chemistry, and materials for energy production and molecular separation. And this is underpinned with a strong technical interest in high throughput methods and robotics. The floor is yours, Andy.
Okay, hello everybody, happy to be here. So I'm at Liverpool and we're interested in a number of different approaches to automation, but perhaps our biggest single interest right now is what we call the mobile or autonomous mobile robotic chemist shown in this video. So this is a approach to automating laboratories which involves connecting modules, sometimes unchanged from their production state, i.e. a GC or an HPLC, without any modification. So effectively automating the researcher rather than the instruments is the gist of it. It was driven initially by our interest in materials chemistry and the fact that in materials chemistry, you're only really as good as the measurements you can do to pick up on the point about analytics. So looking forward to the discussion.
Cool, thank you very much. Our next panelist is Nicola Pohl, and he's an associate professor at Pomona College, and he's interested in developing metal catalyzed and metal mediated organic reactions. Nick, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And I don't have any wonderful, cool videos of a robot, but the value added that I would love to bring to the conversation is about how to implement and educate those who are involved with undergraduate research and graduate students in what can automation do? How can we develop the pipeline? How can we be a part of exposing students as early as possible to the idea of automation? My experience with automation has really been our lab's collaboration with labs at Pfizer, and particularly parallel medicinal chemistry, and helping to show that our chemistry has broad application and in targeting many different molecules at the same time. In addition to that, I'm a part of the Center for Computer Assisted Synthesis, so CCAS NSF Center, part of Data Chemist Network, where we're working on these these really important issues and thinking about how can we take data science, how can we take computational chemistry, and not only enable undergraduate research and collaborations with R1 and in industry, but also how can we innovate in the classroom? Thank you.
That's great. Thank you so much. Moving on, Mimi He is our next panelist, and she's a professor of catalysis in the Department of Chemistry at Imperial College London. And her research focuses on the direct development of catalytic reactions and associated technologies that are relevant to pharmaceutical and fine chemical industries, particularly implementation of flow chemistry in multiphasic reactions. Mimi, the floor is yours.
Yep, so thank you very much. So you heard about my research interests. So I feel, having heard panel one, I'm kind of is the merge of all the panelists in that panel by an academic form. So on top of the flow chemistry research interests I have, basically addressing the areas of hazardous chemistry and the power of flow chemistry to overcome mass transfer resistance. So therefore allowing you to assess larger chemical space for novel chemistry. I also wear two other notable hats in the context of this meeting. The first, I'm also the director of the Center of Rapid Online Analysis of Reaction. So we brought a discussion about centralized, decentralized form. So I believe this is the world's first centralized facility. So it does automation in general, but you would guess from the name, we actually recognize that automation is really taking out a lot of stuff. So realizing actually the bottleneck becomes now the analysis, the high throughput. So we are quite agnostic. We have high throughput robots, we have flow chemistry platforms, and key is also actually high throughput analysis of reaction sets already been discussed about. So this is actually is unusual because rather than actually an institution, so during that survey, I say, do you have one level up in department? This is actually meant to set up as a national facility. It has received funding from our Science and Engineering Research Council. I'll go through the numbers in a minute. So people will say, how much does it cost? I'll give you a ballpark figure because I've been there, got a t-shirt. So it's set up. So in principle, anybody working in any UK institution, either academic or industrial, can actually come to RAW, and we provide access not only to the facility, because we recognize getting access to the expensive equipment is one thing. Knowing what it can do and be able to push that envelope a little bit is also key. And we talk about conservative in industry. You guys are quite conservative. You don't want to push the envelope. And having stuff like that in academic environment, actually, we are not afraid to take that little risk and just push the envelope a little bit and just demonstrate to the community actually what it can do. So starting from a centralized model, the vision is within a few years, it will then become decentralized, just the way that NMR was introduced in the 1960s. Being a niche instrument now, every single department will have a robot or automated equipment is our vision. So we started with a centralized, hoping moving towards encourage the rest of the UK to adopt a decentralized approach. Sorry, it's going to take more than 2 minutes. Second most important thing for this discussion is having this cool infrastructure in place. We want to make sure to deliver the training. So I'm also the director of Central Doctoral Training in Next Generation Synthesis and Reaction Technology. So that's a postgraduate program aiming to produce 60 postgraduate students over 5 years, funded again, co-funded by IPASASI, Imperial College, and industry. So again, it's to train the students in a mindset of actually how to make best use. So just like the mechanical loom has completely sparked the Industrial Revolution and a new way of working, I think this is what's happening in chemistry at the moment. The old way of training people doing things, you need to train them in a new way, new skills. And this is what the CDT is aimed at doing. So all these projects, both of these projects are actually very co-created with industry. So before we started this, we actually did an industrial survey. I suspect some of the audience may actually be contacted by me to fill in a survey form. So we make sure that all the equipment and all the skills that we acquire in both of these projects are highly relevant to the people who will be employed in the future. And of course, having a postgraduate program at Imperial, what I'm trying to say is that for something for that to happen, you really need significant research council engagement, institutional buy-in, as well as a community buy-in for this to be a success. And I hope we have all that. We're slightly above, we like to think we're slightly ahead of the curve. So if it fails, I can share my success and failures, I guess, in a few years with you guys, but I certainly learned a lot in the last 2 to 3 years. pandemic permitting, and I'm looking forward to share my experience with you. Sorry it takes so long, but
thank you so
hopefully
much.
it's relevant. I'll shut it down.
Our next speaker is Rachel Switzky, and she's the inaugural director of the Siebel Center for Design. And she previously served as the executive director at IDEO, a company who pioneered the concept of design thinking. And for the last decade in that role, she helped teams imagine futures and then put them into action, focusing on digital design, emergent technologies, and impact at scale. Rachel?
Hi, everybody. So thanks for having me at this session. I am a non-chemist, and that's been an interesting perspective as I've been working with some multidisciplinary collaborations that have included chemists, computer scientists, AI folks, et cetera. So my center is the Siebel Center for Design at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. And it is all about how is it that we foster multidisciplinary collaboration by using the process of design thinking. And the way in which I can define design thinking is how is it that we're taking a creative problem-solving approach in order to understand who is it that we need to work with, who is it that we need to understand, and how is it that we find opportunities and ways in which to include them in processes, include them into the designs and applications of which we are trying to perhaps inform. So how do we go and learn about, if we're trying to broaden the scope and democratize molecule making and thinking about chemistry concepts that are more applicable beyond very highly specialized folks, how is it that we're able to learn and understand what are people's needs in order to then design for them? So I have been, in my role here at the Siebel Center for Design, have been working with multidisciplinary groups across our campus in order to be thinking about not just in chemistry, but in all sorts of other different disciplines, how is it that we're able to understand our users in order to design for our users? So looking forward to this conversation today.
Great, thank you so much. And then last panelist is Dr. Jin Cha, and he's currently a program director in the chemical synthesis program at the NSF, and he's on leave from Wayne State, where he's professor of chemistry with research interest in organic synthesis, methodology development, and natural product synthesis.
Hi, thank you. I'm a program officer in the chemical synthesis program, and my research interest is in organic synthesis, methodology development, and natural product synthesis. As a synthetic chemist, I'm very interested in knowing the state of the art and applications of automation in academia, also in the industry. Wearing NSF hat, I'm also interested in knowing how NSF can support or promote automation in chemical synthesis. As Anne mentioned, I'm a rotator and my home institution is Wayne State University. Thank you.
Thanks. So now we're going to go into the panel discussion, and the process will be very similar to the previous panel. If you have questions that you'd like to have be addressed, but you don't want to say them, just type them in the chat line and Nikki and I will get to them. If you'd like to ask a question, then raise your hand in the raise hand option, and we'll try to get to all of you. We've got a very big panel today, so I'm really looking forward to our discussion, and hopefully we can cover a wide range of topics and have a fascinating discussion. The first questions that I have is just giving the panelists the chance to address some of the issues from the point counterpoint and from the previous discussion. So the big question, and the one that's like the most easy to remember, is this going to take my job? And so to start, Lee Cronin has volunteered to give his thoughts on this idea. Lee?
Thank you. Yeah, I used to, many years ago, when I was being even more provocative, I would say, of course it's going to take your job. What are you going to do when you go on holiday and all this? But no, the quick answer, and the answer I guess we all guess, is it isn't going to take your job. And what is interesting actually is once we make chemistry automated chemistry more reliable for accessing certain parts of chemical space we couldn't get to before, that people are going to be designing more molecules. And I think the kind of question as posed is a bit like almost thinking when the computer revolution was happening, was suddenly the computerization of programming, was it going to remove programmers? And even today, there's more and more programmers everywhere. So I think organic chemistry is going to transition. So I think it's going to change the nature of synthesis and thinking about synthesis, but also it's going to get very exciting because we're going to be targeting parts of chemical space we couldn't dream of. The other thing I think is really important is people in cross engineering and computer science and process intensification in industry, for instance, are much more connected with the discovery area. And this ability to collaborate between labs that I think is, was described in the first session, this democratization is really important. So I think it's not going to take people's job. It is going to enable a lot more jobs. And I think we're going to have a Moore's law in molecules, right? We could call it after Marty Burke, Burke's law, okay? From the democratization part that he was talking about many years ago, having the right Lego blocks. So if we have this Moore's law or Burke's law of molecule doubling, we're going to have to train even more chemists than before, which I think is really exciting. The other point I'd like to make before maybe letting someone else comment on this is that it's not going to take your job, it's going to make it safer and greener and more controllable. And so that you will be able to do reactions that you wouldn't maybe leave on your own. I've got an automated Schlenk line now, we call the Schlenk computer, where we do the reactive and radioactive stuff. And now we can do stuff on the Schlenk line you wouldn't ever dream of putting a person in front of. Just because, I'm not saying we're being outrageous, right? And starting doing, but it's just that you can be much more rigorous in understanding the digital safety concerns. So I think that it's very exciting. Our job is to also break down that culture, that perception. So hopefully that starts to kind of, move the discussion on a little.
Great, thank you. Rachel?
Yeah, building on what Lee said, I think he's spot on in terms of creating more jobs, because it's really opening up further opportunities to engage with people who have not had the chance to perhaps engage in this content. And if we are, if we're understanding how to make it more easily accessible and removing barriers to being able to engage in this content that is allowing this larger pipeline of people to be contributing at a broader perspective, it's allowing those who have extreme expertise, having that subject matter expertise, to even go above and beyond and be able to really rely on some of this automation in order to open up more astounding opportunities for engagement at your level. So to me, it feels like if we're opening up more people to contribute, that's more content for analysis and understanding. And for me as a designer and looking at opportunities across the entire ecosystem and landscape, it's just allowing us to be thinking about even more connections, more opportunities for creation of additional types of tools, et cetera.
Cool, thank you. Mimi, you had your hand up?
Yeah, so I think this is the nice point for me to introduce. So when people ask me that question, my counterpoint will be, what do you think your job is? So let me be a little bit more concrete. As we say, because of our projects with RAW and CDT, we've been engaging with all our stakeholders. So one of the things is we conducted a survey. So I know do you have my slides that I pre-prepared? So we did an actually industrial survey, and we asked our people that surveyed in industry, what sort of skills do they think will be important for them to employ future chemists in the next generation? What are they looking, on top of course, the usual chemistry skills? And the ones that are highlighted, I'll draw attention to the ones highlighted in red. Very interestingly, these are the ones in which at least 75% of our respondents actually identify at least as highly important. And this is a survey done in 2017. And I would suspect that if I do that again, some of the other areas will also come up as well. I mean, there's also a free form for them to introduce new topics as well. So for people, so just to be very specific about would it take my job, then I'll ask you, would your job actually involve some of these skills and training elements? And again, our CDT program is then built upon delivering these skills. It's, as I say, everything is an open document, so I'm quite happy to share these with people. Of course, the identity of the survey, people survey had to be remained confidential. But if I remember off the top of my head, we have something like over 47 individual institutions responding to the survey. So it's in the UK and also in the US generally. So yeah,
Great.
so that's
Thank you. That's really helpful. Andy, you had your hand up?
Yeah, I'd just pick up on the, I think, closing point that the guy from Merck made on the last panel. I think I'm paraphrasing him here, but I think what he was saying is that the number of jobs in the pharmaceutical sector will depend probably primarily on the profitability of the pharmaceutical sector. And I think that's true for other chemical and chemical using sectors as well. So my argument would be that if these technologies make these industries more profitable, there'll be more jobs, not fewer.
Yeah, it's been really, I really like the Moore's Law analogy as a way of thinking about this. We brought up questions of centralized versus decentralized research, and maybe made the point that, you know, once you get to centralize, then you decentralize out again. And so thinking about that, Andy, do you have any additional comments about this?
Centralized versus decentralized, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting one. I think there's a place for both. We also have a facility in Liverpool which can be accessed somewhat like Mimi's facility. But I think there are some exciting opportunities to bring it back to the academic sort of discussion. I really think there's some really exciting opportunities for distributed experiments and labs working together across the world, where the AI is located in one place, the instruments are located in another place. And I think there's a huge amount of untapped potential there, which has barely even started.
Klavs, do you have any comments on this?
Yes, I very much along the same line as Andy's. I think there's a room for both. You know, if you have particular like catalyst screening and so on, it probably can be very helpful to have centralized facilities. But I think there's a lot of opportunities for people to build their own systems and then interact with other labs like Andy's talking about, either locally on campus or others. And they're not that expensive. There was a lot of talk beforehand about the cost of actually building these automated systems. You know, just like 3D printers now are getting too cheap. A lot of the electronics that go into these systems are very cheap. And so it's actually quite inexpensive to put together systems that can communicate across the world.
Yeah, definitely. Once you avoid the markups from the industrial instrument vendors, you do save a lot of money. Lee?
Yeah, I was going to say that I think that the cost of the equipment is coming down. What is not happening fast enough is the standardization. That's why I decided to release the KDL earlier this year, to make a kind of standard for people to adopt and that would fit into existing standards, right? It's not yet another one. So I think that for the interoperability that kind of Andy was talking about, and Klavs as well, is to think about how we can ensure that we're not just exchanging data in standard formats. That's maybe perhaps the easy part, but without context for how that data is collected and the standardized context for this kind of abstraction, the data will be meaningless. It's a bit like training a neural network to recognize pigeon and a neural network to recognize a cat. And then you're saying, well, why is the network not recognizing my cat? Because you were using the pigeon one. So obviously, if you do segmented learning, you can get around that, but there's a probably poor analogy there. You need to make sure the context for the data collection is understood. And that's one of the big exciting things about that we can be discussing and thinking about the next days, weeks, months. And I have a collaboration with Marty and with Jason Hein and Alan Asperu and Bartosz Jabowski, and we're taking code from each of our labs and using them on different robots. So one standard code, kind of chemical code to make molecule X in UBC, then in Glasgow, then in Illinois, and making sure that that standard code for chemical interchange becomes a bit more pervasive. So that's very important to get that out there.
Yeah, I agree. Mimi, do you have your hand up either for this question or would like to move on?
Just to qualify, I think definitely there's place for both, but actually you have to think about what fits both. For sure, for centralized facility, you're going to go for the state-of-the-art equipment because the stakeholders, people coming to centralized facilities are either people who can't afford it or don't know how to use it. So these will be typically stakeholders from other academic institutions who have no access to this high throughput. They're curious. They are generally the organic chemists. They may be the kind of late adopters. They'll like to know more about it, but either they don't have the access to it or the expertise to use it. This is when the centralized facility will work. And it also works in our experience for SMEs, for small companies, which doesn't have the capital investment to make such an expensive equipment investment. They'll come to a centralized facility, assess a known thing because it is something that's bought that's known to be trusted. And so it's all a question of scalability. So they'll come to you. The centralized model is great because then it's about democratizing. Everybody could have a go, but obviously then it's very cheap, but you have to have the will and the desire to do so. And on that level, we start to implement them, Nick, at the undergraduate level. They are very cheap, as you say, only needs a few, control boards and stuff. We actually have a Lego experiment in our undergraduate lab in year 1 to actually for them to build a very simple UV-vis spectrometer using some Lego bricks, bit of cardboard paper, seriously. But the key exercise there is for them to learn Python programming and how to build in subsequent years actually a feedback loop. So the whole thing will be automated. And particularly during the pandemic year, we ship out these lab in the box to our students. They learn to do it at home. And that level, absolutely, you can democratize it, you can decentralize it to get them to the idea of automation, programming, the kind of language, solid foundations they need so that when they enter at a higher level, they now have the skills and knowledge to now adopt much more complicated system, much more complicated program languages. It's all about actually staging them at different levels. And at different levels, you have different needs, different stakeholders, different ways of doing things. That's my experience here at Imperial College.
That's a great lead into the next topic is teaching. And so I have one question. What would you like to add to your undergrad program that you're not currently doing? If there is anything.
Yeah, no, thank you. So, ACS, just released standards maybe about 3 or 4 years ago, kind of the group that's a part of thinking about what makes an ACS standardized program, accredited program. And there has been a push towards computational modeling and also towards materials. And the biggest challenge that we have, right, is, if you got a big research university, most places can just hire new faculty members with the expertise to kind of teach these things. But if you're at any other institution, you only have so many FTEs, right? And so you only have a position that comes in maybe every 10, 15, 20 years. And so when we have to make another hire, our biggest thing is like, do we hire someone with materials? Do we hire someone with automation? Where do we prioritize what ACS is asking us to do in regards to what to implement to our curriculum? And so one of the biggest challenges, right, is talent and pipeline, figuring out best communicating the value added of having someone who has data science, automation, and computational knowledge that isn't communicated to us, and it isn't communicated as a value added. So when we have to make those decisions about how to build our department and build our faculty, these are the questions that we have. And these are, and I'm sure you look at CNE News and what we're hiring, right? And so I would say we're kind of behind the curve in regards to advocating an automation on the base level of undergraduate teaching, because it isn't told to us that is value added. So if we just happen to get a colleague that loves that, that'd be great. But the more advocacy and the more we can kind of get out that we need faculty members who have this type of expertise, because this is where the field is going. I'm sure our computer science colleagues will love that. because they are under tremendous pressures with enrollments. There's just not enough people to teach all the computer science classes. And chemistry, I think, can help out with that.
Thank you. Jin?
Nick, perhaps you can comment on what's the objective or focus of your teaching at the undergraduate levels? Just introducing the concept automation or hyper screening, or do you go into details?
That's a really great question, Jen. I think if you really break down an undergraduate curriculum, we only have 4 years. And we're competing against all other classes, right, that a student has to take. And so what I describe an undergraduate curriculum is a buffet, right? We're kind of, and hopefully, you know, we may introduce different cuisines and different topics at the time, and hopefully get reintroduced them over the past 4 years. So with automation, you know, I know at Pomona, for example, we have people who are interested in flow and things like that, but it's very nascent. I would say that when it comes to instrumentation, that's where we're having the biggest impact. So for example, you know, in industry, when you separate compounds, you use things like a combi flash system. So in this conversation, that's probably the bargain basement as far as the instrumentation you can probably do. But that's how we expose students to the idea that you don't have to set up a column, right? You can use this automated system, understand what the system is telling you, what the machine is doing. Those are kind of the things we're doing. So we really do teach how these instruments work. Think about what this, you know, there was a question about what the sensors are doing, what is the data telling you, how is that data collected? That's the fundamental things that we aim to teach in an undergraduate curriculum. But we only got 4 years, and we only got them for maybe 1 or 2 classes a semester. So yeah, I would describe it that way.
Thank you.
Rachel, would you like to comment on teaching? I saw your comment about having people of all skill levels and interest levels interact with automation.
Right, right. So with our NSF funded work in the Molecule Maker Lab Institute, we've been creating a kind of ecosystem of tools. And one of those is a digital molecule maker, which again, we're trying to think about how do we now use something like this that has been designed to engage at all ages. So this is something we were thinking about in terms of prototyping and piloting it in K-12, but how is it that we have this tool that is actually quite accessible in all sorts of different ways? So we've launched and piloted right now in a graduate student course, but there are all sorts of opportunities to start using this digital molecule maker program to start building it into the entry-level chemistry courses in undergraduate education here at the University of Illinois. And again, and we know from our research at University of Illinois that these classes are seen as weed out classes, that these are like really difficult courses. And I think that we need to switch the paradigm and make them much more accessible courses to, again, build this pipeline of potential molecule makers, if I'm using my language from the MMLI, and thinking about ways that can a tool like this digital molecule maker lab, how do we make sure that it's something that is, again, it's engaging people in the direction of not trying to prevent them from learning chemistry because it's too hard, so you need to go find another major, but use this as a way to engage and think about if you can see yourself as somebody who can engage in this new language, is what I think of it as, and how is it that you can apply that in a certain type of discipline if it's not extreme chemistry, but how does it perhaps go into all sorts of different angles with this introduction of this tool in order to engage more people in the process of learning chemistry. So I think that this is something that we have a lot of potential of doing, and that we're going to be continuing to start rolling this out and seeing where it goes in terms of how we could start disrupting chemistry education within our, within our purview at the University of Illinois.
Cool. Lee, you got some thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to, a few years ago when we started 3D printing reactors, and we started trying to work out why it was useful to actually 3D print the reactor rather than basically taking, some glassware out. I got thinking about how, Justus von Liebig standardized glassware, right? And this whole process went through. We often maybe take it for granted we have standard glassware in the undergraduate laboratory. And one of the things I think we need to be doing is take that standardization from kind of undergraduate teaching in organic chemistry and general lab kind of manipulations into engineering and doing more complex things. And so rethinking how we do this a kind of, I would suppose, encoding, right? So the Molecule Maker Lab have a specific implementation in mind, which I think is very nice. We have a very similar implementation. In fact, Marty and I have just finished a paper that we'll be submitting very soon, which does some of this, right? Have standardized ways of making molecules against standardized ways of making reactors or customizing reactors and putting them together. So students thinking about solvents, thinking about separations, thinking about workups, thinking about resource utilization. So I think we need to merge those things together, like what I said before about maybe the engineering in the actual practical sense, but at the undergraduate level, teaching chemists to be chemical engineers and electrical engineers, as well as synthetic kind of chemists. And so we need to kind of work out how we can get that in the curriculum at a more fundamental level, right? And that might be quite useful in the future.
Thank you. Mimi?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think I'll extend that a little bit. I think if you ask me, yes, the most disruptive or needs to be disrupted is definitely the practical lab as it's standardly. I mean, typically you have a lab, you have a standard protocol, all the students are issued the same chemical, you do the same experiment. If you're 90% ill, you're a good chemist. If you are 50% ill, you're less good chemist. I don't think that needs to be severely disrupted for two reasons. A, I don't think that's necessarily very motivating for students. And secondly, also it doesn't teach the principle, if you're going about high throughput robotic, data rich, it doesn't actually help them to actually learn how to design experiments. So this idea about maybe getting each student doing a different solvent under different set of conditions and actually using the combined data as a practice of actually learning about statistical analysis, how to analyze data sets, which is also a key point about the future of chemistry. It's not one reaction at a time. It's multiple reactions under multiple parameters, be able to analyze it and be able to understand the reaction network. And to implement that kind of thing, I don't think it's necessarily very difficult, but it does need to change your mindset and adoption. And then I think it also fosters the sense of community, which I love, students communicating with each other, sharing the data with each other, and then be able to duplicate data, etc. So if that's one thing I would change is, currently the way the undergraduate laboratory are run. And then you can think about starting from simple, and then rather than doing the same thing for 4 years running, actually learning and stage it at different difficulty levels. I think that would be really nice if we can start to do that.
Yeah, I really like that way of thinking about things, to foster collaborative teamwork, and also to not just select for the students that are, good at cooking in the original labs when, we need to get their interest. Nick?
Mimi, I absolutely co-sign on what you said. There is a term called CURE teaching, so that having the research experience in the laboratory, and that's what we do at Pomona with our upper level labs. We basically say we have a research question, and we're going to share data, and we're going to have group meetings and present what we have and come up with problem solve together, right? Because that is modeling how chemistry is actually done. And so when it comes to bringing in these automation modules or even talking about that, I think that is a very inclusive way to engage students. And I'm just going to let you know, for everyone who's in the room, for people who are someone who's sitting on the front lines of undergraduate research, that is going to be the expectation when they get into your lab. I'm telling you, 3, 4, 5 years from now, there's going to be an expectation for folks who are in your PhD lab to have more inclusive spaces and to move away from individualism and more collective type of learning. So I'm just forewarning you on that.
So in Zero, we call hack space, which are absolutely these collaborative spaces. So a student from chemistry can actually now collaborate directly with a student from mechanical engineering, with somebody from electrical engineering, and they hack a project together. So having that collaborative space is absolutely will kind of foster that kind of creativity. And young people are remarkably creative. You just give them the resources. Most of the time, it's actually not that expensive. Set them a challenge, motivate them, and they can do the most amazing thing. It's something I've learned about this is they are amazing. connecting the dots might need a little bit more encouragement, but the enthusiasm is definitely there. I have great hopes for our young chemists in the future, for sure.
Absolutely. And then I just had one other really quick point that kind of related to what you were saying is that actually to the previous panel, where we have to develop a curriculum where students are comfortable taking challenges and can communicate between different disciplines. And so when it comes to Rachel's disruptive kind of curriculum goals and having us think about deconstructing what we have is more about de-siloing our disciplines and be able to make connections for every single discipline that's in our department, how automation can be a part of that. And but I'm just going to be upfront, we cannot teach engineering, all this other business, at all these things in an undergraduate curriculum. And honestly, you probably can do it all in a PhD. But what we can teach is like this basic level of knowledge and this kind of, let's try something, let's have these kind of tools to systematically think about how to problem solve. And that's what our colleagues from industry were really kind of communicating.
Cool, thank you. Andy, you got your hand up?
Yeah, I was going to exactly pick up on what Nick just said, actually. As you said earlier, we've only got 4 years. I think we can do a lot better job at introducing these things at undergraduate level, but I think the problem goes beyond undergraduate level, and at postgraduate level training, we still have a pretty siloed environment in many universities, and you're either a chemist or you're a computer scientist. And there's a lot to do there, because my experience of this is, if you're the guy who's, almost built a syringe pump at the end of year one, and your lab buddy has like published 2 communications in the first year, it causes problems with assessment, actually, for one thing, and it causes problems with expectation. So I think it starts at the undergraduate level, but I would by no means assume it's all hunky-dory once you get to postgraduate level. I think it needs to change there too, because there's this silo mentality is still a thing for postgraduate training, at least in many places, I believe.
Yeah, it's definitely the case. I mean, chemists sometimes even silo into their subdiscipline really tightly, and getting them to think, to talk to other people outside of the department sometimes is a big hurdle. Klavs, you got your hand up? Oh, you're muted.
Sorry, I wanted to really second what Andy was saying about really the importance of multidisciplinary interactions. I mean, you sort of have to recognize that you can't learn everything, and there are certain things which you have to specialize, because you really do need the synthetic skills to do this effectively with the knowledge of how you also communicate with people that know how to build systems and people who know the data part. And I think that there are ways that universities can encourage this. I know we have a very collaborative environment at MIT that really have helped that and enhanced that. And I think in a research group at the postgraduate level, you could do this by having essentially a group that has multidisciplinary students in there. You have mechanical engineers, you have chemical engineers, you have synthetic chemists, and you could really accomplish a lot of this stuff, and they teach each other very well. And also at the graduate level, I don't see we need to be siloed. I don't think there should be requirements. Students should be able to take courses across disciplines, and that really will help them get into doing all the machine learning or whatever their interest is that they want to complement their chemistry. But we shouldn't also forget that the first thing they have to learn is the chemistry.
Yeah, I agree. Rachel?
Yeah, and just building on Andy and Klavs, the idea of how do we find these opportunities to ensure that students have a chance to be working multidisciplinary? So how is it that we are, either in some sort of as I call them, a creative mashup class, which we're having next semester. We're hosting one that is bringing computer science and design and chemistry together, so that we are like literally having everybody having a seat at the table, so that we can all start learning each other's language and have like a course set aside to do this. So having these like areas of opportunity to engage multidisciplines at a very early start within a student's career is going to be like, how is it that we're all responsible in these academic institutions to create those spaces and then support those spaces of learning?
Thank you. So next point that was discussed in the Point-Counterpoint is how do we shatter the barriers and democratize chemistry and in particular synthesis? And so, Rachel, would you like to comment on that a little bit more? You kind of led into it with this discussion anyway.
I mean, just shattering the barriers and making sure that how is it that we're understanding what are the needs of different types of people and their motivations so that we can understand, like, why are they scared? What's preventing them from joining this? Again, speaking as a non-chemist here, yeah, I find that, you know, like when I was taking chemistry in high school, it was terrifying and it wasn't speaking to my needs as a learner. And as I am now been surrounded by chemistry for the last couple of years now, it's to me, it's learning a new language. And it's like, how do you make that language more accessible and understandable for those who might have some ingrained fear of a science? And I don't think this is just for like just for chemistry, but just within this context, it is having that kind of having that perspective of the fear that people might have in learning a language that you speak fluently or that it comes very naturally to you. It may not come naturally to others. And how does it that we, again, have empathy around that in order to then design an experience that engages people in the way that they need to engage in order to get them excited, enthusiastic, introduced to then continue on. So that's again, my perspective is, you know, how are we understanding these needs of folks in order to then design these experiences, as I mentioned with, say, our digital molecule maker and other types of initiatives that we have in place with our Molecule Maker Lab Institute as one example. But, you know, this is all sorts of ways for us to, again, think about how do we, you know, again, understand people and their needs in order to be able to communicate, educate, engage, et cetera.
Thank you. And it's really nice to hear your perspective on things because, you know, as chemists, we kind of get a chemistry focused mindset of how can, you know, chemists learn other things, but we also need to remember it's, you know, we're bringing other people into the fold and learning from each other and, you know, everyone benefits.
And honestly, as I've been working with these multidisciplinary teams on campus, where I see all of a sudden I'm like, oh, I'm not alone in understanding chemistry concepts when I'm talking to the computer scientists who don't understand the chemistry concepts either. Or I'm not alone when I see the chemists don't understand the computer scientists. And I was like, oh, light bulbs go. I'm like, okay, so it's not just me, my understanding, but it's like, we all have these like weaknesses and lack of being able to communicate. So how is it that we're able to find common ground or you know, utilize our expertise in order to bring others into the conversation? And I think it's not easy, or we'd have it done already. So it's just more a matter of how do we break it down and take our time into understanding, again, you know, what is it that people need to understand and how do we help them along?
Jen, would you like to comment on, I'm particularly interested in whether the NSF is working on funding these sorts of educational plans?
Well, at NSF, the most typical mechanism for supporting automation or any topic is through research plan rather than educational plans. So we make individual awards by a single investigator or collaborative proposal having a multiple investigator. There are several proposals and awards in the chemical synthesis program where the automation is essential part of proposed research. And also available is a CCI mechanism involving multiple institutions. A CCI stands for the Centers for Chemical Innovation, and Chemistry Division also funds the AI Institute at UIUC, as you know, known as Molecule Maker Lab Institute. I think I got it right, where Marty Burke is among the investigators at the Institute, and Rachel is running the program as well. We most welcome any suggestion you might have how NSF support could support and promote automation in the chemical synthesis and other programs. Perhaps we could be happy to work with CBAT in engineering. They are into automation and technology, and we do work with closely CBAT.
So Spencer Dreher had a comment in the chat about hiring and what they like to see. And so to paraphrase, they found that, learning flexibility and motivation are really important factors in who they hire, and, people can continue to learn and train if they're motivated. And we noticed the same thing when I worked at CIMICS in our hiring decision. Sometimes it was better to hire a, motivated, curious person who had a very specialized training rather than, kind of a bored generalist. So I was wondering if any of the panel would like to comment on, things that you found really work well for encouraging this mindset in your graduate students or undergraduates. Lee?
I've been very lucky for many years that in Glasgow, I was allowed in the chemistry department to take people from robotics, mathematics, and physics background, and I kind of convinced them that chemistry was cooler. So, what the title of their PhD was going to be. This was the first thing, to get people from different backgrounds in. I think the problem is defining the common ground that people talk about is really hard. So the way we did that is by a workshop environment where we'd have the chemists admit they didn't know how to code, and the computer scientists admit they didn't know what a chemical reaction was, and they would then work together and learn and find something new and cool. And I find that iterative approach is quite important. Okay. The problem I'm seeing now is lots of people can program, or at least I call scriptgram, so copy script from places and make very process data in reasonable ways. But there's not enough people thinking about the foundations of the experiments, about a deep level from an either chemical level and kinetic level, and then a computer programming level. Okay, and I think it was Rachel who said, was relieved that everyone was smart but dumb, and everyone was realizing that their blind spots weren't, they weren't alone in those blind spots. And I think having that workshop environment and really understanding how hard this is. I mean, we are building an entirely new platform for programming matter, right? That's the way I look at it, right? This is not something to be taken lightly. Yes, we're kind of, Klavs might be able to say something to this, the flow chemistry has been going on for a couple of decades, and that's great. And there's a lot we've learned there and a lot to be proud of. But now we're going into a more fundamental regime where we're kind of quantizing this ontology so that we understand how to break those unit operations down in that abstraction. And that needs computer scientists to build those approaches. So I think having lots of groups together in generating those new environments is important, and finding a way where we can question it. What I'm going to try and do next year is make a chemical iChem, same way that I think MIT pioneered those, and start to get people all around the world together and solving interesting problems in summer schools to actually build robots for chemistry to do X, Y, and Z, and just get as much participation from the Imperials of the world, the MITs of the world, anywhere, right? Illinois, Glasgow, and to try and get people solving these problems. And if I had my way, I'd get rid of chemistry departments and engineering departments and computer science departments altogether. I don't see why we need them anymore. But that's maybe a bit too radical for this meeting. But perhaps having those working out more constructively how we can get people at those interfaces is important.
Cool, thank you. Mimi?
Unmute. Okay, so in my experience, so Klavs don't hate me for saying that, but it's actually easier for chemists to pick up engineering concepts than the other way around. Certainly in my experience, it's harder for chemical engineers even to learn molecular chemistry. So coming back to the idea of synthetic chemistry again, you'd be surprised because the way that we recruit them, at least they have pretty good numerical skills, they have pretty good chemical skills. So building engineering is just that next level of thinking about mathematically, so they do have the skills to do it. So to encourage interdisciplinary thing, I say actually most of the time is chemists need to reach out to their engineering friends and engage with them. And they have that common language already within the chemistry curriculum, the maths and the analytical science and stuff like that, to be able to unify it. Whereas I think really it is a central science here, what we're talking about here. So yeah, Clef, you have your hand up. You're gonna argue with me now.
Okay, I will tell us.
Certainly in my experience, yeah. Working on flow chemistry projects in particular. You're muted anyway. I invite Clef to counterpoint or disagree.
Oh, you're still muted, Clef.
I just wanted to point out that there's a difference here in education in the UK and Central Europe and the US. Chemical engineers in the US and in Central Europe are taught a lot more chemistry than they are in the UK. So that may have.
It might be true. Yeah, it might be true. But okay, in the context of the UK. So, but again, the idea is
there's nothing. There's nothing to make up for basic education, but I don't think that that's really the point. Which is easier and which is harder. It is really how do we actually effectively communicate together to solve the problems, and how do you actually get the students to understand where they can contribute with the background they have in their education, and where do you have to go and talk to your friends and learn from them.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, if you can understand the theories of quantum chemistry, building a reactor should be a rather trivial exercise, in my experience. As I say, the skills and the ability is there. You just need to unleash them and point them, show them what's possible, and provide the opportunity for them to engage. Chemists can do this, I have no doubt. Speaking as a chemist.
Andy, you had a comment?
Yeah,
sorry.
I totally agree with all this stuff about interdisciplinarity, but the only thing I'd add is we need to sort of break this tyranny of getting results. You know, I mean, PhD is not about getting chemistry results. It should be about learning how to do new things. And I think it's a problem. I think it can be a problem in all disciplines of chemistry, but I think it's a particular problem here. I mean, these things won't be developed if that's the prevailing paradigm, I would suggest.
So moving on to another question. One thing that people think about when they're starting to put high throughput in their department or in their group are, what are the challenges going to be? And so I was wondering if you could share the biggest challenge you faced when implementing automation into your group or into your department. The floor is open. Lee?
Yeah, I can make a comment. When I first started to build robots years ago, the way I did it is I went to my group and said, I built the programming language first, and they just kicked me out. So we don't want to be told what to do. So what I did instead, which was ask them what they wanted to automate, and came up with the environment and say, right, let's just build some robots to do some cool stuff. And that was much easier. And I think bringing people together to look at problems they want to solve. And then that gives rise to collecting data, coming up with new ideas of handling things and safety and so on, and just sparking, what unit operations. I mean, I kind of do think it's a bit of a travesty that in organic chemistry in particular, that we make chemists just do manual labor all the time. That's why I kind of said in the text about Mimi's thing about organic chemistry training being somehow, it's just a bit more brutal, to be honest. Chemical engineers, they're used to actually doing stuff like with proper coding and stuff. Organic chemists are a barrier to each other. And that's something you might want to discuss. That culture's still there. Okay, I found it. I mean, I don't have a very good reception in the UK in organic chemistry because the culture is kind of tricky, let's say. There are gatekeepers. So we need to break that down. I break it down because I just ignore them. Just make sure they don't referee my proposals, and then we're good. And that's hard, right? There are gatekeepers out there who think that, and they're pretending to be open. And that's maybe one of the biggest elephants in the room discussing this stuff. Sorry, I went completely off track there, but it might be worth. It's a really interesting cultural point, and I'm happy to be told it's not a problem, but I think it is, and we might need to face it at some point.
Yeah, definitely. You know, I've noticed that, and in various things in both academics and industry. Klaus, you had some comments? And you're muted.
So I'm not a chemist, so so the automation was actually not a problem. Chemical engineers, as Lee just pointed out, have built large processes that fortunately are well controlled, because otherwise there would be serious implications. And so I think the thing that really helped us a lot was that we actually find chemistry collaborators that were very willing to work with us and explain to us what really would be interesting from an organic chemistry standpoint. So people like Tim Jamison, you know, was a huge help. So Steve Buchwald. And so again, this is this communications business that we've talked about.
Nick?
Wow, this is a very engaging conversation. I will just point out a couple of things. One thing, there's a whole cadre of folks who are in academia who were trained just by the same people, have the same training and same thought process, and also have the same imagination and have the same capability as those who had really well-resourced R1 universities. So if you're having resistance from a particular big name who's an organic chemist, you will find a lot stronger allies for those who are doing research, who teach it, who understand about how challenging the language can be about organic chemistry and teaching that. You know, I love collaborating with other people who are R1 folks, and they love collaborating with me because I take the time. I have no ego, but like the function of my job isn't to write grants 24/7, isn't to be in this pressure cooker of trying to develop a project that a particular funding agency can fund so I can just survive and be promoted, right? It's a fundamentally different like career path in which we actually have a lot of freedom to explore new. It's valued that we collaborate with you all. It is valued that we go and do sabbaticals with you all. And we have students who we can send to you who are incredibly well trained and vice versa. So I would just say that there's actually more people in academia who are not in R1 institutions who can give you, who can have that type of collaboration that you desire and be a part of that team. So just expanding your view out to who are actual value-added people can really, I think, could be incredibly innovative. And that's where most of the people are. Secondly, what I would say is that just to Mimi's point, and this is not to what, you know, everyone has their point of view, but there is a purpose for an organic chemist to really get deep into their skills. In order for us to understand things molecularly, we have to do things in a repeated motion. And I think automation and other things can really help us innovate with that. But I do want to be mindful that we need to respect kind of what it takes to have the skills that can be useful to everyone. So I know that you probably didn't certainly mean it that way, but I definitely want to just say that organic chemistry can be a grind. The culture can be a little wild, right? And there's some dogma behind it, but there is a benefit to know like how to actually pack a column first before we talk about flow chemistry and before we talk about these other things, because they need to know like where it all came from. So that's just the only point that we'll bring up.
Yeah, it's really, really interesting. Andy?
I actually forgot to lower my hand, but I will actually pick up on what Nick said. I agree. I think it's really important to have mixtures of people with different approaches. You know, I mean, you can get hung up on disciplines. Every subdiscipline has some foibles and problems, you know, not just organic chemistry. But I think that the answer is to get a real blend of people with different backgrounds, different skills, different takes on it, and that is absolutely the key. And to answer the original question of what the biggest barrier was to do this, for me at least, it was is getting that kind of blend of people. And once we did, then we succeeded a lot more than when we just had, let's say, chemists. Yeah.
Mimi?
Yeah, just to add maybe a slightly different perspective. So again, when I'm setting up raw and this vanguard that you you talked about. So the naysayers will challenge me and says, automation, hasn't that all been done before? That's what combinatorial chemistry was in the 90s. For those of you who are old enough, like me, to remember that experiment, well, that was a spectacular failure, the automation. So it's just going to repeat the same mistake. And my counterpoint to that is actually, is this different now? So automation, as already been pointed out earlier today in the earlier panel, that's the easy bit. The difficult bit, I think the real challenge and opportunity is, as was raised, the bottleneck becomes analysis. How do you actually analyze all your samples physically for outcomes? And two, the opportunity then, once you know how to do that, the opportunity to exploit machine learning and that kind of data exploration, that's where the really exciting sciences, I think, for the chemists of the future, rather than analyzing the reaction each one on their own as subsets. That's where we're thinking about the reaction as a system, as a matrix, is absolutely key to this, and be able to analyze it. So that's going to be actually the most exciting challenge. So what you do in the lab, absolutely, I agree. For you to drive a car, Nicholas, you need to know what the gear things do. Absolutely, you still need to know how to under the bonnet. So for the first time, you need to explain the theory. But really, what's the value of repeating the column 1,000 times? Beyond that, it's just repetition. And that is when automation can then start to take over to generate the kind of variety of data and the kind of system or complex way of thinking, which is much more exciting in the development of chemistry, in my opinion.
Lee?
Yeah, I was going to say this to my group a lot. To things I don't agree that we have to teach people the things that we used to teach in the past and the future necessarily. So I'm kind of disagreeing with Nicholas a little bit, but there's a bridge. We're going to be in this bridge right now. We need to teach people how to pack columns right now, but we're not going to need to in 10 years' time. And so if you take your car now, you don't, when you tune the car, you don't, or maybe unless you're Zen in the art of motorcycle maintenance and you got your own, you take out the spark plug and you look at the distance and you move everything, put it back. You're not going to be doing things like that. You don't see people, mechanics, taking out these things. They put in a diagnostic kit and look at the combustion, and they get really sophisticated data. They're not idiots, right? They're just, the automation is doing so much more. So a good question for all of us here is to anticipate what kind of bits of labor are we going to throw away. Solvent extraction is one thing. In future, we're going to have universal solvent extractors. We're not going to need that. And why would you want to be throwing students in front of all these solvents and giving them all these additional barriers? And this is another thing I see in the laboratory. There's lots of I suppose that it's almost like, it's not, I wouldn't call it, there's lots of traditions, almost like religious traditions. Okay, how you go in, how you walk up, how you do, why do you need those anymore? And I think we should question that, because we want to make chemistry more accessible. We want to make it safer, and we don't want to intimidate people. And I can tell you, in this crusade, when I started it about 5 years ago, I had a lot of organic chemists intimidate me. All right, not like mafia style, but intellectually very intimidated, throwing me out of lecture theatres, telling me this couldn't be done, and I was making it up and all this stuff. And so I think, well, I'm fine, I don't mind. But now, we now think we're adopting this stuff. How do we anticipate how the barriers to students across chemistry and across computer science, and give them that access? And not just superficial access, I mean deep access. I pride myself in hiring a postdoc who did only work in fundamental theory and quantum mechanics, calculating energies, and within a month in my group, he was building a computer and doing organic synthesis. Okay, and saying, oh, this wasn't as hard as I was told it was. and I think that we have to reskill people, and we have to break down those cultural barriers. And this is a great excuse to do so. Give some people some cool technology, and start that journey. But we have to bear it in mind because it's non-trivial culturally.
Nick?
Thank you, Anne. Yeah, Lee and Mimi, I think your points are incredibly well taken. To be fair, I would say from the US model of things, I'm not quite sure. There's a lot of innovation that's happening in the undergraduate level to make chemistry more accessible. And really, honestly, I think a lot of it was instigated after the Angavanta article that got retracted, which basically illustrated a lot of biases towards students of color, towards women, towards international students. That was a little wild, that got retracted. And I think a lot of that had us rethink about how we're making chemistry to be accessible, not just the language, but also just thinking about how to engage students from a phenomenological point, right? Instead of just throwing the like concepts at them, be like, this is something that we observe. What do you think is happening? Oh, you have these questions. Let's talk about that. So I think there's a lot of innovation that's happening curricular-wise. I also want to just be mindful that this is me taking putting my non-scientist hat on. That's the benefit of working at a liberal arts college. You hear from your philosophy and psychology people. It does sound, I just want us to be attuned to this, and this is no one's fault. This is just reacting against the system and our experiences. What I am hearing about is a lot of trauma from experiences in chemistry, like having horrible teachers that have just completely or colleagues that have completely dissuaded you to think about what the value of chemistry is. And what is manifesting itself in this conversation is also kind of a them versus us type of mentality. And I think, Lee, you've done a very good job, I mean, as well, kind of making sure we kind of bridge those things. But I do want to just bring the human element to it, that we just have to we have to assume that we all want to teach each other our disciplines and that we all want to move forward and push this field forward. And part of that just means welcoming people in versus saying, like, this is your value. This is what we really see what is a value for you. And I think chemists can do that. I think comp sci folks can do that. Engineers can do that as well. I just want to be mindful that we're getting into the space where we're not doing that. And so I think if we just be mindful that we've all had different experience. Like for me, comp sci was horrendous. Right, I had a horrible introduction to computer science, but speaking with my students and just lifelong lessons after that, I've become more open to it. But what I do not do is just say, I made one mistake once, and with a computational chemist friend, like, oh, you just do click, clack, clack, and then just spit out some stuff. And they're like, no, that's not what it is. And so I've learned to focus on the value added of our colleagues, not what they're doing wrong, because human nature, that you're just going to have a hard stop with that. So I just want to just bring that into our kind of mindfulness, that we don't have to do a them versus us type of thing. And so I'm hearing us kind of speak out of both ends on it. And I just want to just focus that and bring that to everyone's attention.
Thank you. That's really, really good to keep in mind. One last question that was briefly discussed at the Point-Counterpoint was the ethics of automation, and is this sort of discussion something that we think we should be discussed in our undergraduate, graduate teaching and research? Is this more of a coffee table discussion, or should it, considerations like this be part of the curriculum? And the floor is open. I'd love to hear people's thoughts on this.
So my initial thoughts, if I'm just thinking about with the ethics, which is so important for for us as educators, for these future folks in developing products and content and science that's going to be, broadening our horizons in our world. But as we have this responsibility for having our students and ourselves be able to, take a look at the world and understand it and make sure that, we have all sorts of assumptions that we bring to the world, that we might think that this is the way the world is, but that we need to be thinking broader than that. And that it's how is it that we can use design thinking, human-centered design, creative problem solving, whatever approach that you want to label it. How is it that we can understand what, things that might be taking place in these other, different types of scenarios that we may not have imagined. And the way in which we're able to do that is to, put our own biases and assumptions aside and take an understanding and look at how people might be approaching the world in ways that we may not have imagined. And again, for good and for potentially nefarious reasons. So I think that this is an opportunity for us to be looking at both the positive and the negative ways in which we open up our pipeline and lower barriers to entry for ways that people might be wanting to engage with our systems in both positive and, again, negative ways.
Thank you. Lee?
Yeah, so the ethics here is really multifaceted. So there's ethics of giving people access who wouldn't have access to a laboratory normally, right? Like for improving that. There's also the ethics associated with undesired consequences. One very tragic thing that I guess, I'm not sure if it was a Boeing, but a few years ago, there was a pilot who got locked out of his cockpit, and the co-pilot committed suicide by crashing the plane. And the way he did it is he put in, he just put the altimeter down so that it went on autopilot into the Alps. Very sad story. Right, and of course, you would think about maybe creating software which would know not to do that. So there's a very interesting discussion to say, how do you, perhaps if you're making modular robotics for chemistry and other things, how could you limit them, or how could you maybe verify that people are doing good things for them? I got an editor of a paper I published kind of contacted me after the paper was accepted and said, oh, we're a bit worried now that maybe, you could do this programming, do something bad. And I thought, yeah, okay. But peptide synthesizers exist, right? And people could make ricin and all sorts of nasty proteins. And so we went through this really constructive discussion about, are we creating new tools that are going to cause danger, new dangers we didn't have before? And the answer is no. But what is really important is we need to have a discussion with policymakers and society and other chemists about that as they become more pervasive, people are going to do bad things with them. And in the same way you could do bad things with anything, right? So, and how do we think about that and maybe control it? One way would be to make, have digital signatures on some things. Okay, have GMP wired in. If you've got these programming languages, you can use encryption. You can use an open chain for verification. But until we adopt a common standard, we aren't going to be able to do this rigorously. We will be able to 3D print a gun in a chemical sense. And we need to ask ourselves, how do we brace ourselves for that happening? I don't know if you've ever seen Dr. Mefspresso, who used Chematica to make some drugs that he was self-making and just put on YouTube, because he wanted to reduce the cost of drugs for himself. Although maybe it should be pointed out, he might be increasing the cost of his funeral costs. But anyway, there's a lot we need to discuss here. It's really interesting.
Thanks. Nick?
I'm not quite sure I have a ton to add to that particular, more than what kind of Lee had to say. So I'll just defer to my other colleagues if that's okay.
Okay, Mimi?
Yeah, so again, as Lee said, you can't stop bad people from doing bad things 100% of the time. Actually, what you can do is stop good people from inadvertently doing bad things, right? So in that respect, again, as I say, my Center for Doctoral Training, of course, a lot of it is about skills and training, but as part of the professional development, and it's actually mandatory by the funding agency, IPSRC, is to incorporate something called responsible research and innovation training. And this is to actually allow the students to assess what they do, their own technology, and actually work out, not just focus, of course, when you're doing a project, oh, this will cure cancer, that's what you focus on, right? But actually have a look at the flip side of it, actually what the negatives of it is as well. You know, plastic is a wonderful thing. If you thought about it, the degradability, if we know what we know now, maybe there's a way that we control it. So this is the idea, is that you again provide the training and the knowledge for the students to really assess the technology from a non-biased level, rather than a gee, wow, this is tomorrow's world. But actually, what's the flip side of developing this technology is, hopefully the students have a good appreciation of that. And this is a mandatory part of our Center of Doctoral Training to deliver that. I think actually now, I think all of us in the UK are doing any big program grants, we have to sign up to this code to practice, to provide training for that. That's a very important side. That also includes ethics on publications and stuff like that. But I think a big part of it to be able to assess your technology in a non-biased way. So as I say, you're never going to stop bad people from doing bad things, but this way, at least you can stop people inadvertently doing bad things. Hopefully that's one aspect of it.
Thank you. That's a really, really great way of putting it. Andy?
Yeah, I mean, this may be unpopular. I don't know. I certainly offered teaching ethics in chemistry, and I think there are a whole bunch of things like equitable supply of drugs in the world, greenhouse gases, plastics. I mean, you could go on and on. I would question, though, whether automation makes the cut yet. Again, coming back to Nick's comment of only having 4 years, slightly heretical view. I'm not sure it's the biggest ethical question in chemistry at the moment, but I think as these tools get more and more embodied, then it obviously gets more important.
Cool, thank you. Well, we're just about out of time, so I'd like to thank the panel again.